Bill, what's going on?
Oh, we're just here talking to you. Going to talk about the Constitution, I think, and things surrounding that.
Yeah, no, dude, I'm super excited, and thanks for opening up your home and let me come in and commandeer your table for a couple hours. This is awesome. Um, Real quick, I mean, you were here in Missouri when I got here. How long have you lived out here now?
Oh, 24 years.
24 years.
Yeah.
Ooh, so you've seen it grow
Yes.
and then some.
Yeah.
Wow. So, real quick, I always like to ask this question. Were you born a fundamentalist?
No.
No?
No. I joined the church when I was like 18 or so. I have a background in Mormonism in that my great grandmother, great great grandmother, some couple of greats back there, at any rate, came across us with the wagon trains.
Gotcha.
And then my great grandmother was a Mormon, but she married a guy from the organized church.
Oh,
And then my grandmother joined the Christian Scientists.
a Christian Scientist?
Yeah. So then my uncle joined the church, and with his influence and a friend of mine, I joined the church.
Gotcha.
And then I started studying and had to go through the whole,
I hate to
paradigm
interrupt you,
shift.
but can you talk up just a little bit?
Okay, I had to go through the whole paradigm shift,
Yeah.
and cognitive dissonance and all that stuff. And it took a lot of study and a lot of, I'm going to go with the truth and
Right.
the hell with what the rest of you say.
Right. That's hard to do. Those days, I remember those days, right? Because you initially, I think all of us that come out of the church initially try to make it all work, right? Make all these old teachings fit with what's being taught now. And
Exactly.
we do those mental gymnastics and we twist and
Yeah,
we
until you can't twist anymore.
yeah, till you can't twist anymore and you realize you got to kind of make a decision. But not to say that there's some folks that can't make it work for them, and if those folks can do that, more power to them. But I know I couldn't. It was tough on me. So we're going to talk about the Constitution today, but just so everyone at home knows, you actually served, right, in the
Yes,
military.
I spent a year and a half in Vietnam. I've had my fair share of being shot at and shooting back.
Right. And you were a helicopter pilot?
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I'll bet you've seen some stuff. There were times that I look at pictures of Vietnam and other than like air support to, give the guys on the ground some cover. I mean, I was like, where would you even land one of those in that jungle?
Well, that would blow up, that'd drop big, what they call daisy cutters and just
Okay.
blow a whole LZ out. The problem with that is that everything turns to kind of an ash gray and you can't tell one branch from another. So rotor blade strikes are quite common.
Right.
So, and you can always find a place. I mean, occasionally we do stupid stuff like shoot up a bunch of pigs and go down and pick them up in the middle of nowhere.
You gotta have some bacon. I
That's
mean,
right. Gotta have your bacon.
right. Well, so you wrote this book on the Constitution. Now this sounds like it's been in the works for a while, right?
I wrote it probably 30 years ago, and it's primarily because my family was having trouble. How do you believe like this? So I wrote the whole thing about the Communist Manifesto, um, and how it works and why we should avoid it. And I tried to put it down the church lines. I was a good, solid church member at the time, and so I tried to, find all the quotes from church leaders and stuff. Interestingly enough, the guy I got most of my quotes from and was able to find stuff told me the church told him he could not put that pamphlet out anymore. He had about a 6 or 8 page pamphlet. It was just quotes from the church leadership on communism and different subjects like that.
So so the guy you got a ton of quotes from, he's actually trying to put out a pamphlet with church leadership quotes, and
Yeah,
they told him he couldn't do it.
right. They told me to do that. And plus the membership.
What year was this?
Oh, so it's about 32 years ago.
So the 90s.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. And so you wrote the book essentially because your family was like, how can you believe what you believe about the Constitution?
Yeah, how can you not, you know, just follow along with everybody? We had a study group and I wrote for the study group. So I sold a few copies of the book to the study group and, you know, not that I made any money, but
Right. You
it,
know, it's funny. I remember when I figured out that um the schools weren't doing a good job of teaching history. I remember I'd sat down with my oldest boy. We were just sitting down for dinner, and I was literally like mid bite, and we were talking about what he was learning in history. Now, I'm a guy that moved back to the Eastern Shore of Maryland just so I could be closer to the history and study more on this. And this is after that, right? So I'm mid bite, and my son goes, "Dad, did you know this that the founders were nothing but rich white slave owners?" And I just kind of remember drop my fork, and I'm like, "What the hell did you just say?"
yeah,
Right in this house, what did you just say? And he was like, "Well, yeah, that's what my teacher told me." Right,
yeah.
and so I had to go. We were constantly deprogramming it, but I don't think that sentiment now is as unusual as what we would like it to be, right? I think that's tends to
Well,
be more thought now than what it used to be.
well, we get into this whole thing on central banking. I can explain what's going on, but it has to do with control and who has the money.
Right.
And you wonder where some of these really nutty ideas came from. Well, the Fed
Mm-hmm.
can write a check for anything. No one's
Right.
ever audited them. So you don't know how many checks they've written and to whom.
Right.
How easy would it be to simply put money in an account? Because it's just a data entry. If you read through the whole thing I've got on the Fed, it's nothing more than data entries for them. They don't have to work for the money.
Right.
They just make a data entry and put funds over here, and then they tell the board of board on the local college, oh, you want a new football stadium, or you don't want a new gymnasium, or you want a new library, or whatever it is. Oh, here, we'll give you some money, but you got to put X, Y, and Z guys on your board.
Mm.
So now, oh, they have X, Y, and Z. Oh, I want you. They need to hire this professor to teach uh, critical science or political science or
Critical race theory or
critical
something.
or something like that. And so you're stuck with that. They got the money, and of course if you look at the uh, universities, they only hire people who think like them.
Right.
You don't get a cross section anymore of viewpoints, and so everyone gets one viewpoint, and that's the whole thing with the Communist Manifesto. The principle that they control education, they
Right.
control money, they control everything.
Right. Yeah. So what's the name of the book?
Well, the book, let's see, what do they call this thing? Liberty and Danger, You Must Not Sleep.
Okay. Liberty and Danger, You Must Not Sleep. How's the book formatted? How's it kind of laid out?
Well, here's the thing. I've got a forward, which is just a one page. And then introduction, I talk about a republic and some quotes from the Constitution of the USA is the Word of God. I go through Mormon scripture, prove that that's the case. If you're a Mormon and you believe in the Doctrine and Covenants, then you're going to believe the Constitution is the Word of God. I mean, I describe Satan's plan. I look at a statement on communism from David O. McKay. And then I have a thing called Which Plan Are You Supporting? And it simply lays out the Ten Commandments, the Bill of Rights, the Communist Manifesto. There's 10 points in each one of them.
Okay.
And so I thought that was an interesting comparison. And then I go through each of one of the Communist Manifesto principles and explain what's going on, why, what do the leadership of the church have to say about it, etc. And then I have
Perfect.
some things at the end, the War Powers Act, class nobility in the USA, some other odds and ends. One of the things that in this title nobility, people think of title nobility, oh, you're a knight, you're a duke, you're an earl, you're whatever. No, title nobility is a special privilege. And so when you get special privileges, it's nothing more than title ability, no matter what you call it.
Right.
The original 13th Amendment to the United States dealt with titles and nobility. It actually got enough muster to pass, but then they just kind of shit canned it.
Okay.
I mean, there's a whole section in the back here that explains how that happened and what.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, let's start with the part where you can prove that it's that the Constitution is God's word.
Okay.
I think that would be a good place to start. And then, because look, at heart, I'm a capitalist, so I want people to buy your book. So I don't want to go through the whole book and then they feel like they don't need it. But let's hit some of the high points as we go through here and just talk about them a bit.
Okay, one thing I wanted to point out, and this is actually from a novel, but it's a quote. The novel was written by Tad Williams, it's Green Angel Tower, Part 1. It says, perhaps it is fortunate that most heroes who die for their people cannot come back to see what the people do with their hard-fought life and freedom.
Yeah, that's the truth.
And I thought that was really interesting. And so there's a wake-up call here, and it just kind of goes through what the church leaders, and the last thing is signed by Heber J. Grant, J. Reuben Clark, and David O. McKay. And that's a warning to church members, is what it's called. And so the Constitution of the United States is the Word of God. And I just, here's Joseph Smith. We say that the God is true, the Constitution of the United States is true, and that the Bible, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants are true. That Christ is true. Joseph Smith, Doctrinal History of the Church, March 1839.
So yeah, let's look at just that quote there. Joseph himself is putting the Constitution in. He's listing it along with other scripture. So he's basically saying that this document is heaven inspired.
Yeah, well, the Doctrine and Covenants 101, 80, 97 to 98. And for this purpose have I established the Constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I have raised up into this very purpose and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. Let not that which I have appointed be polluted by my enemies, by the consent of those who call themselves after my name. This is a very sore and grievous sin against me and against my people, in consequence of those things which I have declared, which are soon to befall the nations. And that law of the land, which is constitutional, supporting the principle of freedom and maintaining rights and privileges, belongs to all mankind, is justified before me. Therefore, thy Lord, justify you and your brethren in my church, in befriending that law, which is the constitutional law of land, and as pertaining to the law of man, whichever is more or less this comes of evil. Doctrine and Covenants 98, 5 through 7. And we just keep going on.
Right.
It's all through there.
Right. So and this is interesting because I don't think that there's another form of government that hangs out there that, well, let me phrase it this way. I don't think there's another sect that calls itself Christian in nature that reveres the Constitution as much as Mormonism
I
does.
think you're right. And I'm going to go on. And this is a quote from J. Reuben Clark, Conference Report, April 35. The statement of the Lord, I have established this Constitution, puts it in the position which it would be if it were written in the Doctrine and Covenants itself. This makes the Constitution the word of the Lord to us. Now, J. Reuben Clark, most people couldn't tell you who he is anymore, but he was an attorney. He worked for the government and was involved in the creation of the League of Nations. Okay. When he saw what the outcome of the League of Nations would be, he went against it and then started preaching for the Constitution because he realized what the League of Nations was going to do. And of course, come 1945, we got the United Nations, which is basically saying crap pile. But this is one of the real leaders of the church back in those days. He was.
I'm familiar with J. Reuben Clark. I'm not a huge fan of some of his doctrine, but I think in other things he was spot on.
Well, again, I'm sure he was very highly educated and probably followed on with Talmage. Probably good buddies.
Right.
And people don't realize that all the damage that Talmage did.
Yeah.
they
He
have
did
no
a
clue.
ton.
They think Jesus the Christ is great, but
That's the
the
book that
whole long,
redefined the
yeah,
Godhead as we
yes,
knew it as Mormons.
yeah,
Yep.
that changed the whole thing. Talmage was a geologist and engineer and stuff from back east, and he's the one who's primarily responsible for moving the lectures on faith out of Doctrine and Covenants.
Right.
Okay, people don't realize that, if you go to the BYU library, which is what I did when my daughter was going to BYU, and went through all the old Doctrine and Covenants, first part of it was the lectures on faith. That was the doctrine. The
Right.
covenants were what we have now is the Doctrine and Covenants. Then what people also don't realize, I sent some of this off to Corey. There were 3 revelations, and it's not that they're so significant, though they had some interesting information in them, that were in the Doctrine and Covenants of 5 European editions and never made it an English edition.
Really.
2 German, 2 Swedish, 1 Danish. The last one was Swedish in 1928. The first one
Wow.
was German in, I think, 1893.
Holy cow.
So I've got copies of this. I went full all that.
That's awesome. Okay. So we got Clark saying what he said, right? Which I agree with him, right? And I never want to be that guy that just disagrees with somebody because of who he is necessarily, right? I
Right.
want to take each statement at its own value. And they're seeing an issue begin to arise even back then, right? That things aren't right, that something is amiss here.
Yeah. And here's just Joseph Smith. I'm the greatest advocate for the Constitution of the United States there is on the earth. Joseph Smith, Doctor of History of the Church, March 1839.
And if it's good enough for Joseph, it should be good enough for the rest of us.
Exactly.
Yep.
That's exactly it.
Okay. Let's talk about the significance of, just for a second, of believing that the Constitution is of God, right? That it was inspired by God.
Okay.
What are the significance there?
Well, as Abraham Clark or Joseph, it's basically like scripture. This is how you're supposed to live, and it's principles. Okay. The Constitution, and we can get into this when we get into the Communist Manifesto, but the Constitution protects property rights.
Right.
Okay. Now, very few, they don't teach this in history, but if you look at the founders of Plymouth, they had this contract with them, and it was basically a socialist contract, and they starved to death.
Yep.
Now, why did that happen? Well, you can get the answer if you go to oh, what the heck's his name? Hang on a minute. I need a blank on my brain.
Okay, no, it's all right. What do you do?
He wrote a book called Making America Skousen.
Okay, Cleon Skousen.
Yeah, he wrote the book Making America, and it explains it in there. But basically, what happened when you have a socialist system going, you know, at the end of the year or whenever it's payday, you're going to get your 300 pounds a week per person or whatever it is. Your 3 kegs of beer and a side of beef or whatever it might be, and that's all you're going to get. And so there is no incentive,
right,
to go out and work harder,
right,
because it's not going to do you any good. And if you do, if you do produce more, it all goes to the committee who decides what they're going to do with it. And so everyone was hardwired to make our life as easy as possible.
Yeah.
And so if you know you're going to get so much, you're not going to put out full effort. You're going to take the time to, play with the kids, play with the wife, do whatever.
Right.
Okay? And I can't say go fishing, because those days go fishing was a productive process.
Right, right.
But they wouldn't spend as much time in the fields as they could. When they're given we'll say 40 acres, whatever it might have been, Now, whatever comes off that 40 acres is yours, okay? So if I don't work it, I'm gonna be really hungry. If I work it moderately, I'll be okay. But if I work it and do all the weeding and everything else it takes and plant the fish heads and stuff in there so everything grows, I might get a little more than 300 pounds of wheat per year, more than a side of beef, maybe, whole side of beef or what, whole beef. So now there's an incentive to do more. And so that's the big problem we have today. When you have incentives to sit in your butt
Mm-hmm.
and not do anything, nothing is produced. If you have 40 some odd percent of the country taking in money that's provided by the others, they're not producing anything. So everyone has less.
Right.
Okay. You, it's like, all of us can produce widgets, but if you only 60% of us are working, you only have 60% of the widgets that we could have.
Right.
There are far fewer widgets to go around.
The other thing you said, and I think this is a big distinction, especially early on in the nation's history and its constitution, is you hit the nail on the head. It's a document about principles.
Exactly.
Now, if we look up until this time in America, where for the first time ever, they said, we're going to put these things down and this will be the law of the land. That's revolutionary during the 1700s.
Yes.
And prior. And this is why. Because up until that point, law was not dictated by principle. Law was dictated by a man, right? You get into the divine right of kings, you get into the monarchies. Law is handed down from the king and then usually backed by the church, the state church, and then that was just the way it was. For the first time ever, somebody had the idea of, well, what if we just do principles? What if we're just governed by principles and not men? And so when we look at the Constitution, it's interesting because this is a document of principle. This is not, it's a government of principles. It's not a government of a man, right? And or at least that's the way it was designed, right?
Yeah.
We may not necessarily be there right now, but that's the way it was designed. And quite frankly, I think that's been the secret to our success for as long as it has.
Well, yeah. One of the founders said, and I can't remember precisely who it was, this is not meant for anyone but a righteous group.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be righteous people for this to work. I think part of the reason that it came the way it was is that unlike in every other country, Canada maybe to some extent, but mostly here, you had people pushing forward in the West, people who were out there in the middle of nowhere, independent as hell.
Mm-hmm.
And that whole culture came back.
Right.
We're here. You can't tell us what to do. You're nowhere around. I got to fight off the Indians myself. I got to fight off the bears myself. I've got to make my crops grow by myself. Maybe a couple of neighbors to help.
Right.
And so you got very independent minded people who are going, I don't want to do this.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. What do you got next?
Oh, here?
Yeah.
Well, that was just, Wilford Woodruff, all kinds of church. David O. McKay was a big one. I don't want to read all this.
No, just, yeah. If
Get
there's
bored
one that
after-
really catches your eye, go ahead. But I mean, yeah, we don't have to read it all. We can just move along as you're ready,
Okay.
Phil.
Okay, well, here's David O. McKay, an instructor. Next to being one and worshiping God, there's nothing in this world upon which the church should be more united than in upholding and defending the Constitution. President Benson, unless we as citizens of the nation forsake our sins, political and otherwise, return to the fundamental principles of Christianity and of constitutional government, we will lose our political liberties. Our free institutions will stand in jeopardy before God of losing our exaltation.
Yeah.
Okay. No, okay, this is known from David O. McKay. No greater immediate responsibility rests upon members of the church than to protect the freedom vouchsafed by the Constitution of the United States. and that's Conference Report 1950. The other two are for President Benson's Conference Report 79 and um, David O. McCabe instructor. So, I mean, they're telling you that this is, and if you want one a little more recent, present, Spencer W. Kimball, the only way one can keep our freedom is to work at it. Not some of us, all of us. Not some of the time, but all the time. So if you value your citizenship and you want to keep it yourself and your children and their children, give it your faith, your belief, and give it your active support.
So I should say this. It seems to be up until about I the late 90s, as far as I can tell, that the church, even though it had problems after, the manifesto and those sorts of things, the church has always been a stalwart defender of the Constitution.
Until
And
the
then,
last 25 years or
yeah,
so.
and then things have kind of fallen off the rails a little bit. What do you think that's happened up top that has caused this to that has caused the church not to be
Well,
as overtly supportive as what they used to be?
well, many years ago, um, I was talking to a sister in the Lord, and her husband was a golf professional at the Pacific, not Pacific Grove, but in Pebble Beach.
Okay.
Okay, where they used to call the Crosby, and now they call it I don't know what the hell they call it
Sure.
now, but they used to be Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. It's a big thing. Shows my age.
Yeah.
But she said I couldn't stay in the church if President Benson became president because of his views. And I looked at that and went, whoa. And so I think you'll find as you go through history of the church, I mean, all the way back to the ancient times, that it's rare for the church to survive more than about 40 years until it disintegrates into something else. I mean, it holds the same name. You can go to Abinadi, and King Noah had gotten rid of the priest, put in his own priest, and everybody's, is the whole thing has changed. And it didn't take very long for that to happen. So I think what happens is, as the people fail to believe the leadership at the time, the Lord just changes the leadership out and gets, people who aren't going to preach to you anymore, or they just get tired of saying the same thing and just shut up and let you go down the road. I'm not sure which it is. I think it's a combination of both to some extent. You can see that people don't. I got in trouble in gospel doctrine once because I pointed out that the Lord will allow you to send you lies if that's what you want.
Right.
They go, no, that never happened. It couldn't happen. It's all through the scriptures. It's pointed out twice in Chronicles and Kings. It's pointed out in Isaiah in several places. On and on. You don't want to believe the truth? I'll send you lies. I'll send you great delusions. I'll send you. You don't want to believe it. You don't want to do what's right. Okay, here you go.
Right. Right. That's exactly right. And I don't think I think it's one of those things where the Lord just stops giving evidence for the truth, right? If you're so determined that you want to believe this lie, then I'll get out of the way and let you believe this lie. I think something else interesting happened, and that was there seems to be a time in which within LDS church history where there's this idea of, well, we're going to go global, so we have to start changing how we talk about the Constitution. And not that that was bad, right? Joseph said this church is going to fill the world, right? But that can't happen at the expense of true principles, right? And so, in my estimation, as I've looked at the timing of things and I've looked at who has ascended power at certain times, I think the um, massive directive that the church was operating on is we just want butts and seats. right? And so whatever we have to do, if we have to scale back about talking about the Constitution, we can do that. If we have to scale back on talking about certain other principles, we'll do that, but we got to get butts in seats. And, I can kind of see how someone could rationalize it away a little bit, right? Where you say, well, if we just get rid of this, then there'll be more people in church and that'll be good because then we can talk to them about Christ and the Lord more. But it's a slippery slope, right? Because once you start compromising principle, you're no longer preaching the same gospel.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of this probably came from some well-meaning people, but the idea was was flawed.
Yeah. Um, again, I think it's that. I think it's partially because people didn't want to believe it. They didn't want to do what it required. Um, and it says in ether what it talks about you get these secret combinations above you, you're going to be in serious trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I'm kind of pointing out, this whole thing of the Communist Manifesto. This is how they've gotten above us, and this is what they've done to us. And it doesn't matter whether you talk about the school, which they say the government owns all schools, or if you're talking about property, where the communists say you can't own property. If you can't own property, you're not going to take care of it.
Right.
You're not going to take care of it. It's going to crash. And people don't realize how bad this gets, but I've done a lot of reading World War II. And one of the things I like to point out is that the German prisoners are talking about their experiences when they're after the war and they're still prisoners in the Soviet Union. And they went, and this gun guy is saying they wanted to build this project, and it was took, we'll just say 1,000 bags of cement. I'm not sure what it was, but it was a big project. And under communism and socialism and central planning, you have a big old guy up here that says, oh, this is how many bags of cement we're going to produce, this is how many shoes we're going to produce. And so you're rated on how many shoes I produced. I produced 10,000 shoes. Doesn't matter if they're crap. You produce 10,000 shoes, you made that the requirement. Well, in this case, they're producing cement. So however many bags, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, doesn't really matter. But he says when the bags of cement hit, because it's not an open economy where, oh, I'm running a cement plant and I think the demand is this, so I'll produce extra number of bags so we have extra bags. No, they just produce, you're only allowed to produce what they tell you to produce. Well, the guy up there at top has no idea how much cement is really required. He only knows that my project needs this. Well, so if it's a 5-sack mix for cement, by the time the guys who ran the project filtered off some bags so they could build their home projects, because you can't get cement anywhere else. And so all this stuff was taken off and sold for cash. I think it came down, there's like 2 bags mixed for cement for the project. And they built it like that and it fell apart.
Wow.
Because there's a demand for the cement.
Right.
But you can't meet that demand because of the restrictions of government. And so people just steal.
Right. Yeah, and that's the other thing that we know from communism is it breeds a form of organized crime.
Oh yeah,
that is self-existent within that government, whatever government decides to
and the
incorporate
thing
it.
that makes it interesting is that you develop a black market
Mm-hmm.
that runs as long as it's helpful to those in control.
Right.
The second it's not, they just shut it down.
Right. Absolutely. No, good stuff. All right, so we've kind of covered, that the Constitution is God's plan. We've read some statements that really back that up, from the earliest guy in Joseph Smith down to Spencer W. Kimball. So we've established that real well. Where does the book take us next?
Well, there's a statement on communism, and then there's which plan are you supporting? And it's like run out the Bill of Rights, the 10 Commandments, the Communist Manifesto. So you can kind of compare. Each one's 10 points. You kind of compare them to each other. They're not a direct comparison. One doesn't really tie into the other. But the 10 points gives you something to look at and why things are the way they are.
Okay.
So I thought that was interesting. Then we come into one of the worst parts and one of the biggest principles of communism, and that's principle one, abolition of private property.
Okay. And this one's huge to me. And I'll explain why. As a land surveyor, one of the first courses I ever took, it was made abundantly clear that one of the things that separated America from Europe and everywhere else was this idea of property ownership and property rights. It's pretty, it's not as common in Europe to own property as it is in America, right? And one of the things that owning your own property does is it allows you to build your own wealth, right?
Yes.
And if that's inhibited, that goes away. So that's important stuff.
Well, and what people don't realize, even though if you're in a socialist society and they tell you to take care of these 5 acres, that's still not your property and you don't get anything off of it. You just get what they decide to give you. Okay. So here's Doctrine and Covenants, the first part of the principle one. We believe that no government can exist in peace except such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. Doctrine and Covenants 134-2. Okay. Here's another good quote. God has endowed man with certain inalienable rights. No legislature and no majority, however great, may morally limit or destroy these. The function of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. Anything more or less than this is usurpation and oppression. President Ezra Taft Benson, Conference Force, 1968. And here's one of my favorite ones here. It says that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. McCulloch versus Maryland, Fort Wheaton, Crandall, Nevada. So this whole power to tax, they didn't put a limit on it. And so I can tax you for 5%, 10%. Okay, you go up to Kansas City and it was like 10 point something percent when I bought something up there.
Wow.
You know, down here it's like 6 or 7. But I remember when sales tax is 2 and 3%. But there's no limit on what they can do. And we'll get into taxes here after a while. And I follow my daughter, and it gets pretty obnoxious as how much they take.
Now, let me ask you this. Here we just read where the Lord says in D&C 134 that one of the principal purposes of government is to protect people's property rights. Correct. Right? That's the Lord. That's not Joseph Smith. That's not Brigham Young.
Nope.
That is the Lord saying, look, one of government's primary functions here is to protect property rights. Under communism, what happens?
You don't have any property rights. You don't have any property. They take it all.
Right.
And the fallacy in all this is it all goes to central committee. Well, again, we've already seen what happens when you have that. No one has any responsibility. And so they followed somebody down the street once, and the guy was just throwing trash on the floor. And they said, "Why do you do that?" "Well, it's not my sidewalk. You know, somebody else can pick it up." That's kind of what happens. You don't care because, you know, I have this thing, my responsibility this year is to take care of this 5 acres, we'll say. But next year, it may be a different 5 acres. Any effort I put into this to make it better,
Right,
will not benefit me. So why should I? Again, we're hardwired to make our life as easy as possible. So if it's not going to benefit you, you're going to do the absolute minimum. Whereas if that's your 5 acres and your livelihood depends on that 5 acres, and you can keep everything off that 5 acres or sell whatever, you're going to bust your butt to make that more productive.
right. I should probably point out that this is one of the more, this always ends up being one of the more bloodier parts of when a communistic regime takes over, because people don't part with their stuff willingly most of the time.
No.
And so what tended to happen, especially in Russia, especially in China, if you put up a fight against this, they would execute you to take that ground, right?
Oh, yeah.
And they didn't do it out of a sense of they didn't do it in the guise of, hey, we just feel like this would all be better for everybody if you know it was under a committee. It was done with the precept, and this is the tool that they got it done with. And I think it's super important is they created an us and them kind of mentality, right? It's critical theory, which basically says your political dynamic is it has to exist between an oppressor class and an oppressed class.
Yes.
And so they often painted the landowner as the oppressor class. And they would say things like, well, you own this land, but all these people work on this land. And really, this should kind of belong to them too, because they put in all the effort. And then it was easier to say, yeah, that guy's your problem. We should execute him and take his ground.
Well, several things come of that. One is, like in Cambodia, um, they went out to the fields and they, of course, the farmers objected, and so they just killed the farmers. And they didn't like the people being in the cities, and so they took the people out of the cities and put them out on the farms. Well, guy who's, sold trinkets in it downtown has no idea how to work that land.
Right.
So production drops to nothing. And did they whip people in the streets? Yeah. My daughter was just here, one of my daughters, and with her husband. He's from Cambodia. He was there. He watched his relatives get caned to death in the street.
Jeez.
Okay. His mother was fairly well educated, and they had to flee through the jungle into Thailand. He came here and done very well. But this kind of stuff, they would put people who have no knowledge out there because they just think people are people.
Mm-hmm.
And so you put somebody who's never hoed a row of weeds in their life out there to now farm. What are they going to do? They're going to make a hash of it.
Right. Did it stop just with land, or did it go to other
No.
things like automobiles and tractors and that
went
sort of
to
thing?
everything in Russia. If you read, there's several books out there about the Ukraine. You can read any one of them.
The forced starvation in Ukraine.
Yeah, forced starvation and so on and so forth. And what they did is they would say, they always start this way: that big landowners, they're they're the enemy, so we're going to eliminate them. So they get rid of them. And now you're down to small landowners. Guys might own 1,500 acres. So these guys are really the bad guys because they're preventing you from doing whatever. So they eliminate them. Then they go down to the guys. They go down to the guy who owns 1 acre. He's oppressing you because he owns land and you don't.
Right.
And so they just kept changing the parameters and killing these people. And they would literally go in and say, we want all the wheat from here and all the stuff. And they would ransack houses, do everything else. And the people had nothing,
Right.
And they're starving all over the place. And the wicked part about it is that New York Times was saying how wonderful things were over there. And they had this one reporter who was saying how wonderful things were and ignoring the dying bodies in the street in the Ukrainian places. Because my theory, okay, they're tied into it. And they're tied into it by the money from the Fed, which we can get into later. But
right.
You have to, people go, well, Lenin got to Russia. How did Lenin get to Russia? Lenin got to Russia in the middle of World War I when everything was chaos. And he had a train that went straight across Germany with no stops. How the hell did that work out? Some revolutionary without some serious money behind him.
I thought Lenin was Russian by birth. I knew Marx wasn't. I knew Marx was from Germany.
He was not he was in Europe and had to go.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, he went to Russia on a train through Germany, World War I.
Oh, okay. I see what you're saying. So somehow he makes it through war-torn Germany without ever a stop.
Right.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so basically under communism, right, we see that it's the exact antithesis of what the Lord is saying, right? The Lord is saying government should protect private property rights And then you have communism, that's the exact opposite, that says,
that?
no, this will be owned by the
People.
the people,
But
the
it's really owned
Politburo,
by
right?
whoever happens to be in control.
Right. Okay. All right. So that's point one that I think that we did really good there, where we could kind of see what the Lord's plan was in communism. I mean, what the Lord's plan was versus communism.
Okay. Okay, and just one last comment here. This is from a fellow named Tom Bethel in 1981. Propaganda has encouraged many of us to believe that public property is owned by all. Actually, it is the property of the state.
Yes. Yep.
So, we're gonna move on to
Yep.
principle
Yep.
two.
Let's
Okay,
just move on to
heavy
principle two.
progressive income tax. Now, here's an interesting thing. Why would you have a progressive income tax? Why do you want to control people? Hold people down. You can make the tax laws as they've done so complex that no one can understand them. And remember, the tax when they first started income tax was supposed to be 1 or 2%. By World War II, it was up to 70-80% on the rich. And then they backed it back down. But it's a matter of control, because if you look at the Fed, they can print all the money they want. They don't need to tax you to get money. They just print it.
Right.
So why do you have heavy progressive income taxes? Control.
Right. So with heavy progressive taxes, let me ask this question. When Russia came in, it was my understanding that there really wasn't a tax like you and I would understand it, because they just took everything.
Yeah.
Right. So is there anywhere in the Communist Manifesto that talks about taxation? Is it talked about in terms of a stepping stone
Well, principle two is a heavy progressive income tax. That's what it is.
inside the Communist Manifesto
Yeah,
itself?
that's
Okay.
principle two.
Okay. So it's obviously then like a stepping stone, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What is there anything the Lord has to say about
Oh,
taxation?
yeah. Okay. All right. So let's see. Okay. Speaking of King Noah, and he laid a tax of 1/5 part of all they possessed, a fifth part of their gold, and of their silver, and a fifth part of their ziph, and of their copper, and of their brass, and their iron, a fifth part of their fatlings, and also a fifth part of all their grain. Yea, and thus they, King Noah and his priest, were supporting their laziness and idolatry, and in their whoredoms by the taxes which King Noah put upon his people. And thus people labored exceedingly to support iniquity. Now, here they're complaining that they got 20% tax.
Mm-hmm.
We would love to have 20% right now,
Right.
because we're running. I'll get further in here. We're running way higher than that. But what's interesting is if you go back to the scriptures, and you had a righteous Joseph sold into Egypt. He took over everything, and because they were starving, he had saved up grain before the famines hit. He had all this grain, and he eventually they sold, people sold their grain, and they sold, oh, not their grain, but they sold their cattle, and they sold them everything. They finally wound up selling themselves.
Right.
So Joseph in Egypt has bought everything the people have, and he charged them 20%, 1/5 of their increase every year. And that was their taxes, their religious obligations. That was everything.
So it was like an old school flat tax.
Yeah, it was old school flat tax, but it's only 20%. They got to keep 80% of what they did. And that's when he owned everything. Now here, King Noah, they own the land, but he's still taking a fifth.
What verse was that in Mosiah again? Because there was something there that jumped out at me.
Mosiah 11, 3 and 6.
Mosiah 11.
3 and 6.
All right, give me just a second. I want to go there because I want to read that again, because there's something there that I think is a principle that we have to come to an understanding of. 11, 3 and 6. And this is super important, and it's a point that I'll make with an actual topic here. All right, I'm just going to read this again. So 3 says, and he laid a tax 1/5 part of all they possessed, a fifth part of their gold and their silver, a fifth part of their ziph and of their copper and of their brass and their iron, and a fifth part of their fatlings, and also a fifth part of their grain. Now down to 6. And yea, they were thus, and excuse me, yea, and thus they were supported in their laziness and in their idolatry and in their whoredoms by the taxes which King Noah had put upon his people. Thus did the people labor exceedingly to support inequity.
Yes.
Now, this is important because when the government takes your money, you kind of don't have much of a say after that point
Exactly.
on what they do with it. Now, let me give you an example of this that might be kind of extreme, but I believe it fits. I was a weird kid growing up. I mean, I was the kind of kid who would party really hard and then listen to Rush Limbaugh
Okay.
all in the same day. So I was always kind of on the political right side of the abortion issue, right? I always said, yeah, that's a lie. You probably shouldn't mess with that. Then I adopted my twins. I became a Mormon, and I adopted my twins, who just had horrible problems when they were first born because of all the things they were exposed to while in utero. And I saw them fight for life. And where I thought I was pretty strong on being pro-life, I became 10 times stronger when I saw them struggle and work really hard and overcome and become healthy and strong. I remember when the leak had happened on the Dobbs decision, where it basically said abortion was going to be returned back to the states. I remember I kind of wept in my truck because I was like, okay, this will slow it down some. And I remember that night I got home and I hit my knees, and I was just going to offer a prayer of thanksgiving. That's what that was about, right? And I was like, thank you, Father, for making this possible. And I got an answer almost immediately, Phil, and it wasn't an answer I thought I was going to get. The answer was, don't thank me. All I've done is return the power back to the people, and people can decide for themselves. So I started doing some research into what this decision meant, the Dobbs decision. It didn't outlaw abortion. What it did is it returned the power back to the states, and now the states get to decide. So let me take verse 6 again, where it says, "Thus did the people labor exceedingly to support inequity." When it was being done through the federal government, and the federal government was using our tax dollars for abortion, we really didn't have a say at that point.
Right.
Right? Now, if you live in one of those states, and I'll list them off here: California, Washington, Oregon, parts of Nevada. Well, yeah, parts of Nevada. If you look, even parts of Utah, if you look over at the east side of the state, New York, Pennsylvania, just go down the eastern seaboard till you get to about North Carolina. Kansas, for some strange reason, in the heartland, have all basically doubled down and said, not only are we good with abortion, but there's been some talk about, what they call post-birth abortion, right? Infanticide. If you live in those states and you continue to live there, you're kind of making a choice now, right? On where your money's going to go, where those tax dollars are going to go. And so if it was me, I'd get the hell out of those states, because I have a feeling that that's where judgment will hit the hardest when it comes. But before that Dobbs decision, we didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Now we have a choice. And I think this is important in our elections, to realize that the guy who you give the nod to is going to dictate where those tax dollars are going to go.
Yeah.
And that should be taken into account, because look, I get it, right? I'm not a huge fan of Donald Trump, but I like him a hell of a lot more than I like Joe Biden, right?
Yeah.
Now, if abortion is murder, Bill, and that's a human life, which I believe it is, if you can hold your nose and vote for Joe Biden as a Mormon, isn't that a lot like saying Hitler did some really great work if it wasn't for the Holocaust? It's the same argument.
Yeah.
And I think people need to understand this as they're looking at things and realizing that, sometimes it does come down to one thing. But this is stuff that can't happen without this taxation, right? Now, do you believe in like no taxes at all?
No, for me personally, I would go to a flat tax.
Right.
If it were to me, I would say flat tax. I mean, even if you go back to the one Samuel was talking about, you're going to take 10%, like that was a bad thing. I would limit taxes to a flat tax, uh, basically a sales tax of some sort on everything sold, doesn't matter what it is. 10%. So much goes to Fed, so much goes to state, so much goes to local, and that's it. You cannot tax anything else other than imports, exports, and things of that nature. And the reason I say that, now you've gotten rid of the whole income tax bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have to do this accounting every year, which is a pain in the butt for everybody. I hate
Right.
doing taxes because we've got, a couple of businesses and yada, yada, yada. And it's just a pain
Mm-hmm.
and a waste of time. And in some ways, it's slavery because you're working for nothing,
Yeah.
you know.
No, that's exactly right.
And when I go down to this, it's heavy progressive income tax. Slavery is illegal in this constitution. So what defines slavery? It's working without reward.
Right.
So if I work and pay taxes and they provide a fire department, police department, judicial system, military defend us, yada, 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 that's fine.
Right. That
But if you're giving the money away to people who aren't working, no, I'm not getting any benefit from that. And I look at it no better than Tammany Hall in New York,
right.
where they're passing out $1 to vote for us or free drinks. There's no difference. I'm going to give you, I promise I'll give you an Obama phone if you vote for me. There is no difference. It's just buying votes. That's all it is.
Right.
It's nothing more, nothing less. They couch it in all the terms, oh, these poor people need this, poor people need that. We've always had poor with us. And the churches and do-gooders can take care of that. And the advantage to doing that is that if you're a do-gooder, or a church member, or whomever that's working in the volunteer kitchen or whatever, you can say, this guy, been soaking funds for us for eons and hasn't done a damn thing. I'm cut him off.
Right.
He can, because I'm not going to keep supporting somebody who doesn't want, is indolent and lazy and doesn't want to work. But the government, you give me a job where I've got 20 people on welfare, okay? That I'm responsible for them. How can I improve my life? Well, if I cut down the number of people on welfare,
You might cut your own
I
job.
might cut my own job. But if I can add people to it, if I add 40, now I can get one guy to do the first 20, one guy to do the second 20, and I can be the supervisor. I make more money.
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly how it works.
Yep.
And you can talk about all the compassion and BS you want, but that's basically what's happening. And you can't get away from that. It's
No.
human nature to make your life better. And so you're not going to get these people off of welfare because that cuts your own throat.
Yep. Yep. I'm with you. A flat tax and then maybe a sales tax, but get rid of the income tax. And we also need to get rid of property tax. The fact you have to continue to pay the government for owning something, you don't really own it.
Yeah,
Because they always have the ability to come and take your ground if you refuse to pay it. It's not taxation at that point. That
it's
becomes extortion.
extortion, confiscation. California is great for that.
Hmm.
I remember and I put it in the book. I had a truck and it broke down. It was a 1-ton dump truck. But I didn't pay the fees on it one year. And so the fees doubled and it cost more to register the damn thing than the truck was worth.
Yeah.
And so I let it go for parts to somebody. And that's just theft because I thought like my worker here, Brad says, I paid more for the truck and taxes than I paid for the truck originally.
Right.
You
Yeah,
know,
absolutely.
yeah.
Okay, good stuff. What's our next principle there?
Well, I'm still going through this one here.
Okay.
Um, and I have to read the whole thing, so I'm just going to summarize it. Basically, I took my daughter, who was making like, I don't know, it was eight or $10 an hour back then, working in a fast food restaurant, and she a dedicated payroll. She didn't get very much because you got to look at it from this. So I did a whole thing here on the payroll. Basically, sum it up. You get, if your workers will pay, say, $10 an hour. Okay. What happens is you see we'll say a 25% tax to the feds, 5% tax to the state. So that's 30%. Then you pay your 8% or so Social Security. So now you're up to 38%. All right. But your employer pays the other 8% of Social Security. And then he pays all other little taxes, and workman's comp can run anywhere from 5 or 10% up to 60% if you're a roofer. So now, from your employer's perspective, all right, your paycheck says $10 an hour. It's costing me 12, 13, 14, $15 an hour. And by the time I take that 30%, you're only getting $7 an hour.
Right.
So you're getting half of what it's costing me. The other half all goes to the government.
Yep.
And I will remember talking to a guy in this is Salinas, California, and he says my worker came to me and he was all pissed off. And he said, "Why?" "Well, you took all this money out of my thing." And he had to explain to him that the government was taking taxes out of his paycheck.
Right. Yep. That's it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And this is where I think we need to talk about the really progressive income tax too, because to me that's so counterintuitive. What you're doing is that you are actually penalizing somebody for being successful,
Exactly.
right? The more money you make, the more they're going to
The more
collect.
it hold you down, the more it keep you from catching up to us
Exactly.
who are doing well. And I point out that the average worker is paying more than 20% the Nephites had to labor exceedingly. The average worker is paying 50% or more. And in the Book of Mormon, when the Lamanites were taking 50%, they considered it being in slavery.
Right.
And here we're running, depending on who you are, you can be paying 60, 70%. Because when I was talking about 50%, we weren't talking about sales tax. We weren't talking about the property tax. We weren't talking about import or export taxes. We weren't talking about excise taxes. People don't realize, buy a box of ammo, okay? You're paying tax on a tax because there's already an excise tax on that box of ammo for 10%. And now you're paying, so let's say it was $11 box of ammo or a $10 box of ammo, you're not paying 11 because the excise tax. And then you got another, if you're in Kansas City, another 10% on top of that's another $1.10. So over 20% of that purchase is taxes.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then there's the unseen tax, right? Which we're in right now with inflation, right?
Yes.
And you add that on top of that. And that number is since 4 years ago, it's up 20% average. And so you add that all up and it gets pretty spendly pretty quick. And you're right. I don't know what the current figures are, but it used to be that this was just a year or two ago that you had to work till like April before your tax burden was met, right? Like if you were to break it down,
Yeah,
you gave 4 months away
exactly. And
before you
that's not,
started amassing anything.
and that's just counting in tax out of your payroll. That doesn't
Right.
count everything else.
No, nope, you're right.
Okay. Here's a Spencer W. Kimball Conference Report 63. One who reads the Book of Mormon will see that people are taxed from 50% and then to totalness to slavery and to bondage. He'll see power greedy, paternalistic, centralized governments move towards the inevitable revolution, which finally impoverishes but frees people to begin again from the ashes. And then Anne Rand from Wake Up America, or America Wake Up, excuse me. The man who produces what others dispose of his product is a slave.
Right. Yep. Absolutely. You know, I didn't like a lot of her end conclusions, right? That,
Yeah.
but you know, because it was pretty much absent of God, and I do believe that there are responsibilities that come with our rights, and
Yeah.
she wasn't necessarily a believer in that. But how we get here, she was spot on.
Yeah. Well, you cannot have a freedom or a right or privilege without a responsibility that goes with it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You can't do that. And so all these people say, oh, yeah, but they have a right to housing, they have a right to medical care, they have a right to this. You cannot do that without making somebody else a slave.
Right.
As soon as I say that is a right, you are entitled to that, and you're going to force somebody else to provide it.
Right.
It doesn't matter, the doctor or whatever. And here's what happens coming down from the trenches, because I spent a lot of years working in the medical. I was down in Texas getting an EMT, and this truck pulls up, and guys all panic. Oh, my buddy's really hurting. They flocked him out and put him on it because we haven't had a chance to assess him yet.
Right.
Put him on a gurney and run him in, and the truck takes off. Well, the story behind this is this guy was what we refer to as frequent flyer. He's been in there quite a few times. drug overdose.
Gotcha.
You know, stoned out of his mind. And I talked to docs. Well, I says, this is probably his fourth or fifth time in here. It costs probably $25,000-$30,000 to process this guy.
Right.
And who picks up the tab?
The taxpayer.
The taxpayer picks up the tab, and we're picking up a tab for somebody who's a useless piece of crap.
Right.
I don't mind, the first time around, because everybody makes mistakes. We'll patch this guy up. But after that, I think they ought to put a tattoo on the back and say, the second time in, you're being stupid, just throw you out in the gutter and let you die. Because if you don't do that, he's going to continue to do the same thing because you're just supporting him in his stupidity.
Right.
You're causing everybody else a bunch of money, and most of those guys are stealing crap.
They are.
And so when you're putting this jerk back out in the street, he's going to go steal from somebody else, and he's going to create trouble and cost you thousands. If you put them all together, it's billions of dollars in the medical industry for taking care of people. Another case of this is another frequent flyer when I was flying EMS helicopters. And this is not all that uncommon. You'd have this particular individual we're talking about. Don't say where he's from. But he was diabetic. So, the system fixes him up, puts him on welfare, says, here's what you have to do. And he wouldn't.
Right.
He wouldn't eat right, everything else. And all of a sudden we get a call. So we fly over there, we pick his sorry ass up, we drag him down to nearest hospital. They patch him back up, send him up, repeat a few months later. And a helicopter ride is multi-$1,000s.
Right.
It's not cheap. And a lot of it is because we only collect about 60% of what we build, maybe 65%. The rest is just, and then if you fly the guy and he's on welfare, get enough money out of that to buy the fuel. That doesn't pay the crew, that doesn't pay maintenance on the aircraft or anything else. You just get enough money to buy the fuel. And so people complain that, why it's so damn expensive to get a helicopter ride. Well, yeah, because we're giving a third of it away, and then you're adding all these other obligations and stuff onto it. So yeah, it gets expensive.
Right. Yep. That's your tax dollars at work.
Exactly. It's just, we'll get into farming. There's a bunch of stuff on there.
Perfect.
It never ends. Okay, so now we go down to kind of what we talked about, abolition of inheritance. Okay.
Meaning what? Explain it. Like you couldn't pass things down to your kids?
Yeah, it's, right now, a lot of places, it was a 50% inheritance tax, so I have, my grandfather leaves me, about $10,000, the government grabs five of it,
Phew.
okay? That's how they wanted it to work. Okay, so here's, today we are in danger of actually surrendering our personal and property rights. The development, if it occurs in full form, will be a sad tragedy for people. And recognize that property rights are essential to human liberty. That's David O. McCabe, Congress Report 62. And I say here, we will spend eternity with those who will allow us no more freedom than we're willing to allow them.
Right.
So as soon as you say that, oh, I'm going to tax you, then you're open to be taxed. And I explained that I think in the tax thing. I said, here's the problem. I own a table saw. The government decides it needs money. So it says, oh, well, we'll tax all table saw owners. No one objects because maybe only 10% of people own a table saw. So they tax the table saw. And then the next time we go around, they say, well, we're going to tax bread makers. No one complains because only 10% of people own bread makers. This continues on until everybody's being taxed because you weren't willing to defend somebody else's right.
Right. No, that makes sense.
So, so that's what this is, and this is just a matter of taking, you won't be able to pass stuff on. So what the big guys have done is set everything up in a trust, and many of us don't have the money or the knowledge or the capability to put everything in a trust. So,
Right.
but the Kennedys and all those people have everything in a trust. They don't get an inheritance tax.
Yeah. You know, and we can look back and all through, especially in the Doctrine and right, we can start with Abraham, right? The Lord says that this land is your inheritance.
Yes.
Right. We can look at the Doctrine and Covenants, and the Lord is talking to the saints about getting an inheritance in Zion. Right. So this idea of inheritance is obviously something that the Lord's a huge fan of, right?
Correct.
And again, communism comes along to kind of short circuit that and go in the exact opposite.
Well, in every case, it's the prophets up to a point that said that communism is Satan's plan.
Well, absolutely.
Satan's plan is to put you under absolute dominion and control. And it's really easy to do that if you can't grow your own vegetables, if you can't own your own property, if you can't, you have to work where they tell you to work at, what way they tell you to work at.
Yep.
See, you and I can go and you can say, hey, I'll survey your land for X amount of money. They can accept or reject that.
Right.
The communists tell you you're going to go survey this and we're not going to pay you, or, because that's just part of your thing, or you can't make a negotiation with this.
No, there's no negotiating with the government. They're going to get what they want.
Yeah. Okay. So principle 4, confiscation of rebels' property. To a communist, a rebel is anyone who is not a communist. Taking the rebels' property destroys their ability to resist. Without property, you do not have the ability to produce goods or carry on life. With loss of the means of production, become totally dependent upon the state. With that total dependency on the state follows total control by the state. Well, this seems far-fetched. Just investigate for yourself how much control the federal government exercises over programs it helps finance. As soon as you accept the gift, in quotes, of finance from the federal government, you become subject to their rules and lose the free agency of your actions and choices. As the federal rules and guidelines imposed are accepted by the exception of the gift. Those who are carrying out Satan's plan and want control will seek the control through any means at their disposal. Capital, banking, must protect itself in every way through combination secret and through legislation. Debts must be controlled, collected, and loans and mortgages foreclosed as soon as possible. When through a process of law, the common people have lost their homes, they'll be more tractable and more easily governed by a strong arm of the law, applied by the central powers of wealth under control of leading financiers, international bankers, quote, question mark. People without homes will not quarrel with our leaders. This is well known amongst our principal men now engaged in forming an imperial of capital bankers to govern the world. By dividing the people, we can get them to expend their energies in fighting over questions of no importance, whole thing of blacks versus whites, women versus men, etc. That's not in this quote here, but back to it. No, of no importance to us except as teachers of the common herd. Thus, by discreet and secret action, we can secure for ourselves what has been generally planned and successfully accomplished. Bankers manifest for private circulation among leader bankers only taken from Civil Service Yearbook, the organizer of January 1930, and also from New American February 1934.
So much of control comes down to if they can take your means of production of food, livelihood, any of those things, right? There's a guy that I love to listen to on podcasts. He does quite a few. He's always a guest on somebody else's, but his name's Tim Kennedy. And he was a SEAL. And one of the things he had talked about was Americans should kind of be ungovernable, right? In the sense of you can't take their food because they get it themselves, right? They're in charge of their own protection, those sorts of things. And so when the people that the government doesn't agree with gets to have their stuff confiscated, well, they're no longer really a threat, right? And they can control you without ever really firing a shot.
Exactly. If you're dependent upon them for your daily bread, you can't complain, because as soon as you complain, they'll shut off your daily bread. Doesn't take very long to go hungry before you can get real cooperative.
Right. Yeah. And I think that the confiscation of who they deem to be rebels is worrisome, right? In some ways, it's using the legal system to silence political dissent.
Oh, exactly what they're doing. Look at what they've said about the military, like myself, who are retired. Oh, you guys shouldn't have guns. I mean, that was
right.
You shouldn't have this, you shouldn't have that. You guys are just rebels, and and who's the real rebel here?
Right.
We're trying to preserve the Constitution, freedom of mankind, that kind of stuff, and they're trying to exert total control.
Yep.
And so, so this is probably my favorite one. And can we get a picture of this?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get.
Okay. So what is that there, Phil? I'm going to show that to the screen. Explain to me. May not work. I may have to just take a picture and put it in my. You can email me that picture and I'll put it in there, and I'll make it a slide. What is it that we're looking at there?
What you're looking at is a $20 gold piece.
Okay.
That's dated 1861, as I recall, and that's the number of $20 bills that now take to buy that $20 gold piece. And that's of couple years ago. It's now 30 more. So that was 91 $20 gold pieces. Now it's 121 $20 gold pieces. So the dollar is worth less than a penny of what it was back in 1913 when the Federal Reserve took over.
I've had a guy on the podcast before named Kelsey Williams, who is an economist, essentially, right? And we've talked about this at length, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about, because this is more insidious than just a flat out tax, because this is a tax that's hard to see.
Yeah.
Right. And just like you were saying, our pennies now, our dollars are just over 99% worth less than what they were in 1913. You want to run through how it was we got to that point?
Okay.
And
now this is a quote from Lewis T. McFadden, chairman of the House Bank Committee in 1932. Okay, he's talking to the House of Representatives. Now you're gonna have to understand that Lewis T. McFadden, by about 1934 or 35, had died mysteriously.
Huh.
Okay,
Coincidence.
coincidence,
I'm
yeah.
sure it's just a coincidence,
Yeah.
Phil.
Some people think the Federal Reserve banks are United States government institutions. They are not government institutions. They are private credit monopolies which prey upon the people of the U.S. for the benefit of themselves and their foreign customers. The Federal Reserve banks are the agents of foreign central banks. Henry Ford has said, the one aim of these financiers is world control by the creation of inextinguishable debts. The truth of the Federal Reserve Board is the usurp of the government of the United States by the arrogant credit monopoly which operates the Federal Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve banks. Okay. This is by Wright Patman, chairman of the House Banking Committees, 1964. What we call cash reserves are simply bookkeeping credits entered upon the ledgers of the Federal Reserve banks. The credits are created by the Federal Reserve banks and then passed along to the banking system. A dollar represents a $1 debit to the Federal Reserve system. The Federal Reserve banks create money out of thin air to buy government bonds from the United States Treasury, lending money into circulation at interest by bookkeeping entries of checkbook credit to the United States Treasury. The Treasury writes up an interest-bearing bond for $1 billion. The Federal Reserve gives the Treasury $1 billion credit for the bond and has created out of nothing a $1 billion debt which the American people are obliged to pay with interest. Where does the Federal Reserve System get the money with which to create bank reserves? Answer, it doesn't get the money, it creates it. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money. The Federal Reserve is a total money machine. It can issue money or checks. Okay. Now that brings up something here. We talk about money, and I think it's here. I think I can bring it up on this. Hang on for a minute here, 2 or 3. Come on. Okay, let's go. Oh, you probably like that one.
That's pretty good.
Let's see if okay. That's a $5 $5 silver certificate.
Yep.
Okay. If you go to Black's Law Dictionary, which I have in there, and I can send you copies of all this
Okay.
with this.
Yeah.
Okay. A note requires 4 things. It requires a signature,
Okay.
which you'll see is there.
Yep.
It requires a due date, which in this case is on demand.
Yep.
It requires who it's payable to, and it says to the bearer.
Right.
It says what? Silver dollars.
Right.
Okay, that's what it says. That's a silver certificate. It's in my safe someplace. All right. Federal Reserve note. It's signed.
Right. It is.
It doesn't say who it's payable to. Doesn't say what it's payable in. Doesn't say when. So
Wow.
4 of the things that make a note a legal note are missing on a Federal Reserve note. So it's really not a note.
Interesting. So it's simply
Bullshit.
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's the thing. See, is they can write a check for whatever they want. Never been audited. So you don't know how many institutions they've put money into. You don't know what these institutions have done with the money. You probably trace a few of them, but not very many. So you are a college professor or college board. You need a new football stadium. You need a new library. You need a new whatever. They say, I'll give you that, but you got to put so and so and so and so on the board of directors. And so that's how you get all these liberal college folks, because they're doing the bidding of the people who bought them a new library or a new sports arena or whatever the hell it was.
Right.
And that's how they get control. And they just not all you have is certain people that they want. You know, I mean, there are a few conservative college professors. I had one guy as a black guy who was a business guy, and he'd actually run a business. And one of the best professors I ever had. One of the worst was a guy who was an economics professor, who was an arrogant SOB, and he had been a college professor and a student his whole life.
Right.
Never been out in the world, never knew what it was really like. I mean, I'm going to diverge here just a little bit, but I remember driving down I-5 coming over the hill, looking down Los Angeles. Okay. And there's a sea of people. And if you've driven down I-5 coming from like Sacramento,
I have, yeah.
all right, you'll notice that you might see a house every 10 miles. Because you're in the backside of the Coast Range Mountains where all the farming takes place. All the ranchers are there, actually. They don't do much farming up the hills. The farming's, if you're driving down south on I-5, the ranching's on your right and all the farming and fields and crop rotations on the left. And all these jackasses down there who've never hoed a row of weeds in their life are making decisions for the farmer.
Right.
And that just does not work out. And one of the changes I would make across the nation if I were king for a day is I would change it. And and this comes from being up in upstate New York the last few years. They hate New York City. They despise New York City because New York City has all the population. The thing I would do is say, you're going to have your lower house based on population. And you're up, and that population has to go by even counties, or you can divide a county directly in half. You can, none of this gerrymandering bullshit that you're doing.
Right.
Okay. And you can have one representative from every county. So what happens, like in California, if you go to the Northern California and the sparsely settled places in the Nevadas and in the farming regions, because there's not that many cities, Yuba City and a few of those, Fresno, that kind of stuff. But basically, it's all open land and just a few farmers in there. They don't get any representation
Right.
because they do it by, so you might have, 4 Senate districts or for in Los Angeles in a county, and you might have 4 counties to make those districts up in Northern California. Well, the difference between the rural and the downtown is massive. First off, a lot of folks in the rural probably don't understand much what's going on in the city, but it's even worse going the other direction. I've lived in big cities. I lived in DC for a while. I've lived in several big cities. I've lived in a rural place, and they have no earthly clue, none whatsoever. And so they're making, like I say, decisions for farmers with no knowledge whatsoever what farming is, or making decisions for lumber industry.
Right.
And they have no earthly clue what's going on. They just think everyone out there to cut all the trees down and blah, blah, blah. If they thought about it for 30 seconds, why would the timber industry want to cut down all the trees? They don't, because it puts them out of work.
Right.
You'll want to take this 1,000-acre patch and cut 10-20% out of it, and take that 1,000-acre patch. And by the time you come back, if you're working 10 or 20,000 acres, 20 years later, you got some timber.
Mm-hmm.
Oaks is a little different story because it takes longer to grow. But if you're talking pine, it grows pretty quick.
Right.
So, you're instinctively saying, oh, they want to rape everything. No, they don't. They want to stay in business. If they
Right.
tear everything down, they're not going to be in business anymore. They're going to be more conservative with that stuff than you're going to be.
Right. Right. Well, and I think this, back to the federal bank, right? The Fed. I'm not sure that there is as insidious of a way of getting a country to comply than the Fed. Have you ever read a book called The Monster of Jekyll Island?
Oh yeah,
Yeah, I think
we
that
have that.
that absolutely lays out what the Fed was.
Actually, I think it's called the
Creature of Jekyll Island.
Yeah.
Yes, excuse me. And it absolutely lays it out. And in my opinion, as I look at things now, I think that we will have runaway inflation at some point.
Oh yeah.
I think
It's already runaway. We just don't realize it.
I think we're already seeing the beginnings of it. I feel like that if inflation is a bear, we just sat back and emptied the chamber into the bear, and the bear's still coming.
Exactly.
Right. I don't think there's much they're going to be able to do now to keep this in check. It's gonna, I don't know when or anything else, but I'm fairly certain that there's massive inflation coming our way.
It used to be. Okay, trying to go through the history of money. I don't do that here very much, but if you could listen to Hugh Nibley, he's explaining it. Pecuniary or flocks was the original money.
Yep.
But it's really difficult to carry sheep in your pocket to the market.
Or divide up sheep. So
Yes, exactly.
right. Yeah.
Sheep usually objects.
Right.
But gold and silver. And I got in a discussion with Douglas today. He was saying, well, I don't care, but the problem is gold is useful. What? Well, electronic circuits. So if you got something like gold in your hand, it's always going to be useful for something.
Right.
Now it's going to be good medium of exchange, but it's good medium of exchange because it's useful. Silver dollar makes so many electronic circuits. People don't realize that gold is put in the chin bubbles from some of the windshields of the helicopters because it has properties that make that better for light refraction and stuff. There's tons of silver in a nuclear submarine. All
Right.
this stuff
Thank you.
has uses. So when you go away from that, now you can print whatever. And the problem is these people in the Fed, they don't have to work for the money. They just put another zero on it
Mm-hmm.
or two zeros. They're feeling generous to themselves, and that's all they have to do. And then we have to pay it back through sweat and blood.
Yeah. Yep. And look, there's never been a country in the world that has printed as much money as we have and had it turned out good.
No, it
Right.
never will.
And I remember I had a college professor once who told me the laws of economy are a lot like the laws of physics. At some point, they're going to be obeyed.
Yes.
Right. You can delay it for a while, but at some point, physics will take over.
Okay, here's a couple of things. The Federal Reserve Bank is an institution owned by the stockholding member banks. The government has not a dollar's worth of stock in it. And then this one here is really interesting. It's something I've talked about. Overnight, the Federal Reserve System has raised the call rate to 20%. Unable to meet this rate, speculators' only alternate was to jump out of windows. The Federal Reserve Board had already warned the stockholders of the Federal Reserve Banks to get out of the market on February 6, 1929. But did not bother to say anything to the rest of the people. Nobody knew what was going on except the Wall Street bankers who were running the show. Those in the know began the sale of all speculative stocks and put their money in government bonds. Those not privy to this secret information contained to hold their speculative stocks and lost everything they had, as in previous panics, enabled Wall Street operators to know to pick up the blue chip securities for a fraction of their value. Now, what they're talking about here is the call rate. So if you have a call rate of 5%, what that means is I have 5% reserves, and I can load the other 95%.
Right.
Okay. So when they raise the call rate to 20, all right, what happens is now I had 100,000 in the bank, I could loan out 95,000 of it. Now I still have 100,000, but I've got to keep 20,000 back. Now I can't loan as much as I did before.
Right.
So what happens? Well,
credit starts to seize up.
Credit starts to seize up, and what happens when that happens? Well, the wealthy guy who's got money and just wanted to borrow it because he didn't want to bother goes, oh, well, I can't take this loan. So some business deals start falling apart. But now it gets worse because he says, I'm just going to go ahead and do mine. So he pulls his $20,000 out of the bank. And now the bank doesn't have that much to loan. It's got 20,000 less at 20% call rate. That's, considerably less than it was before. And so now even more loans collapse. And the whole thing just implodes on itself. And then all they did was change one little thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and now it's even a little worse than that. Do you know what the discount window is?
Yeah.
Within the banking system?
Okay, explain what you mean.
Okay, so the discount window was this. In the old days, before 2008 and all the new regulations that came in off the back of the last recession, there was something called the discount window. So if you were a bank and let's say you couldn't cover your deposits for that day. So let's say you loaned out more than you took in, you would essentially go to another bank
Borrow.
and borrow. And that was fairly normal practice, right?
Yeah.
The bank would look and be like, they're good for it. You know, if you're Wells Fargo and I'm US Bank, well, you're Wells Fargo. I know you're good for it, right? Then after 2008, something happened. And then in about 2020, something really bad happened. So there was always this thing called the discount window. Now, the discount window was payday loans for banks, it was higher interest with a quick turnaround. So this would be something like, hey, I need a loan, but this time if I'm, US Bank and you're Wells Fargo and I go to you and I say, hey, I need a loan, and you go, you know what? We all know each other's books, and I don't think you're good for it. The only place I could go was to the government discount window. And what you'd have to do is you'd have to go in there and you'd have to say, I need a loan to cover these deposits, and then I'll pay you back in the morning. Now, that came with a much higher interest rate than if it was bank to bank. The other thing before 2008 is that if you went to the discount window, every other bank knew about it. And the reason that was is so that every other bank can be like, that dude's in trouble. We don't want contagion, right? We don't want a bunch of us failing. So let's not loan him money. So when he can't pay it back, it sinks us. After 2008, now there was always a limit too. It was a very small limit, bank for banks, right? It's huge for a normal person, but it was small for banks. After 2008, they basically said, well, now you can go to the discount window and you can borrow a lot more, like up to 70 some percent of your total business value. And the other thing is now it's private. So now these other banks can't see what's going on. In 2020, it got even worse because they upped it again. Now, last time I was kind of taking a look, almost every single bank was using that discount window. That discount window is managed by the Fed.
Of course.
And so it's essentially now it's hooked banks like a dealer hooks a user on
Cash.
on heroin, right?
Exactly.
The cash is the new heroin for these banks, and they're just getting hit after hit. And the whole time, the Fed continues to set it up so that when they can't get their fix, they will step in and take it over. And so, what we're seeing now is a shift, right? In which before the Fed would kind of lie to you and be like, "Look, we're just here trying to prevent major economic catastrophes like depressions and recessions." And now it's pretty much they are running the entire show.
Yeah. And
through our money.
Well, that's what happened after the crash in 1929 is many of the banks, because they couldn't take loans and people were going broke, and they're confiscating farms and all that kind of stuff, and people couldn't pay the debts. They just started taking over the banks because the banks were going belly up.
Yep.
The Fed just came in because they can create money out of thin air,
right,
and took them over.
Yep.
So many thousands of small banks went under during
Absolutely.
that time period. And everyone says, "Oh, how wonderful the Fed! They're guaranteed with 100,000, or in case of maybe raising up." They're not doing you any favors, because they're creating that money out of thin air, and they're making you pay it back in blood and sweat, and they're
Yep.
creating just another data entry.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. Okay, here's one too. Lightning over the Treasury by John L. Ellison, page 57. When a California banker was asked by Andre Norskott, the author of We Bankers, how it came to that the Secretary of the Treasury was no longer on the Federal Reserve Board, his reply was, because it kicked him off the board. Then the Norskott asked why the President of the United States is no longer on the board, and his reply was, because it kicked him off the board.
That's telling, right?
Yeah.
That's telling when you can literally tell the supposed leader of the free world, yeah, you're not on this board.
Yeah. Okay. And then we have done this. Page 210, 211. Deficit spending and inflation produces constitute a hidden tax against all Americans, especially those who own insurance policies, have savings accounts, or are retired or on fixed income. Every time the dollar drops another penny in value, it's the same as if the government had counted up all the money you and I had in our pockets in savings or investments, and then taxes on 1% on each dollar. The tax in this case, however, does not show up in any W-2 forms. It's hidden from view in the nature of higher and still higher prices we pay to buy stuff.
Yeah. Yep. We were talking about that earlier about inflation being the hidden tax.
Okay, and here's another one too. You request a definition of the dollar as distinguished from a Federal Reserve note. Federal Reserve notes are not dollars. These notes are denominated in dollars, which is the unit of account of the United States money. The Coinage Acts of 1792 established dollars as a basic unit of the United States currency by voting that the money on the account of the United States shall be expressed in dollars or units times tenths, tenths, and hundreds. Federal Reserve notes may not be converted into gold or silver. It's Westerlund, Assistant Secretary of Council, Department of Treasury, February 18th, 1977.
Mm.
So they're telling you right there, the Federal Reserve note is not dollars.
Right. Can you read this one by Mariner Eccles?
Okay. Okay, let me go back here. Okay, so right below it, Congressman Patton, Mr. Eccles, how did you get the money to buy those 2 billions of government securities? Mr. Eccles recreated it. Mr. Patman, out of what? Mr. Eccles, out of the right to issue credit money.
Okay, now if I'm not mistaken, this this Mariner Eccles was LDS.
Oh, it wouldn't surprise me. Oh, no, wasn't George Albert Smith. It was right after him.
Was he a president of the church
President of the church.
after Joseph F. Smith?
After Joseph Smith.
It would have been Heber J. Grant.
Heber J. Grant. He was all excited about the Federal Reserve moving into Utah.
Okay, do you remember you remember that Utah tried really hard to get a guy named Reed Smoot into Congress and got it done?
Yeah.
Smoot
That was in 1904, as I recall.
Smoot was one of the ones who was responsible for the Great Depression, the Smoot-Hawley Act, right? So if we want if we as Mormons think that, oh well, we would never fall for this, I would say you may want to check your facts, because we do have a history of falling into this sort of stuff.
Well, we just explained two of them right there.
Right.
You know, and that's that, and that's if you go and look up Dallin H. Oaks,
Mm-hmm.
you'll find that he's worked for Warren Court.
The Warren Commission.
Yeah, and he worked for not the commission, but he may have, I don't know. But he also worked for numerous other communist organizations.
Really?
Yeah, you can just look up his name and go down all the organizations and find it.
Mm. Interesting.
And say this is the guy who, when Mark Hoffman,
Right.
those aren't familiar with Mark Hoffman, he sold a bunch of fake documents to the church to Gordon B. Hinckley specifically, and then wound up killing several people to kind of cover his tracks, and was arrested, and they were going to put him on trial. He was likely to go to trial, and Dallin H. Oaks went down and talked to him, and he just suddenly admitted guilt. And imagine how embarrassing a trial would have been for the church.
Yeah.
So what was said to Mark Hoffman that shut him up?
Right.
Okay. Well, how can you say that? It happened.
Right.
They were going to trial. They didn't go to trial. Dallin H. Oaks went down and talked to him. the trial stopped after that. That's fact. Speculation on your part is whatever.
Right,
And
absolutely.
if you don't like the conclusions, don't blame me. I'm just presenting the facts. Your conclusions are on you.
Right, absolutely.
So let's see what else we've got here on this. Yeah. Yeah, definition of coin, but I don't know, can we go with that? I mean. Okay, let's see. Okay, thought this a favorable moment to shut and bar the door against paper money. The mischiefs of the various experiments which have been made were now fresh in the public mind and excitedly discussed of all respectable parts of America. By withholding the power from the new government, more friends of influence can be gained to it than by almost anything else. Paper money can in no case be necessary. Give the government credit and other resources will offer. The power that may do harm, but never good. Ellsworth to Making America Clean on Wisconsin. It's interesting. I remember, I think it was a History Channel, and they made a deal with the Indians for X number of $1,000. And they showed up with this big chest of the military, to guard it. They opened the chest, it's full of paper money. Indians told them to take it and stuff it up their butt and burn it all. Told them to go to hell.
Right.
And take it. Indians are smarter than most Americans.
Yeah.
Yeah, just paper money is never good. The only way it can be good is if you had the notes like they were in the silver certificates, but you could audit the bank. And in the old days, centuries and centuries ago, when the bankers would issue notes that were not redeemable, they got hung.
Right. Yep.
People went out, well, I have all this paper and you can't give me gold or silver for it.
What am I
Most people are
supposed to
smart
do?
enough not to take this crap, especially now we know you're done.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
And if Roosevelt had come clean in 1933, because he promised the people that he would not get rid of the gold and silver, and the very next year, within a year, he did. So he's
He did.
an SOB.
Yep.
If he had just put the bankers' feet to the fire, we'd be a hell of a lot better off today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
We would have hurt because they couldn't redeem everything in gold and silver.
Right. But at least we would have been back on a standard with something that
Exactly.
was tangible.
Exactly. Something tangible. And one of the reasons for gold and silver is it limits you. You can only produce so much of it.
Right.
So, yeah. And you might have some, changes in prices and stuff, but it's not going to be terrible because it's going to be locked in a certain.
Right. It'll
parameter.
create stability.
Yeah. And one of the things people don't realize, and I bring this out in here, is that it's terribly unstable when you don't have that.
Right.
That's what allows Joe Soros to destroy countries with this inflated currency and stuff, because it's no big deal to him. I got my own theories on George Soros, by the way. I think he's just a front man. But you got all that money floating around, and I'm trying to collect my thoughts back again. But it limits you.
Yep.
To what you can and can't do. And it makes you responsible to that point. Whereas there's no sense of responsibility.
Yeah, there's
there's nothing.
Yeah.
And it's that limitation I was going to talk about that keeps things in line. You can't inflate it, and if you have this whole thing, they can't be audited, is complete BS. They should be audited every year.
Regardless. Yep.
Regardless. And if you've been, inflating the stuff it's unauthorized, we'll hang your ass.
Yep. Absolutely.
I mean, it was, according to Act 1792, it was a death sentence to fake money.
Yeah.
And they did that because once you start doing that, the destruction is unbelievably harsh. And again, that photograph,
Is a prime example.
yeah,
Yep.
it takes, as of the last time I checked, which is a week or two ago, takes 131, 121 $20 bills to buy a $20 gold piece.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
that's ridiculous.
Yeah. No, it absolutely destroys wealth, right? It
Yeah.
destroys personal wealth, and that's really probably the end goal for them anyway.
Yeah,
And
that is
so,
their end goal. But I explain that to people. I say, listen, okay, let's say your grandfather, your great grandfather, go back 1913, be my grandfather. But I'm old and dirt now. So he works and he puts a $20 gold piece in a safe deposit box for his great grandchild. And then he works and for the other grandchild, he puts a $20 bill in there.
right.
Come forward from 1913 to 2023, 110 years later, that $20 gold piece is worth over 100 $20 bills. And that $20 bill is worth whatever someone would give you in last year because it's kind of cute.
Right.
And that's it.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
all his labor, basically about a month's worth of labor, has been stolen from him.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more.
And here's one. In the afternoon, Mr. Bagby called to collect county and state taxes. I burned three $20 bills of the city script, paper money, while it was burning and said, so may all unsound currencies go down. Gave my clerk in sections not to pay any more taxes on the Hotchkiss purchase, Joseph Smith Jr., History of Church, Volume 5, Chapter 15, page 228. Section 4, that any person passing a paper currency or abiding and abetting therein or holding the same with intent to pass it within the bounds of this city corporation shall be liable to a fine of $1 for every dollar thus offered or passed, to recover it as an action of debt. One half of said fine to be paid to the complainant and the other half to said corporation. Joseph Smith, Mayor, History of the Church, Volume 5, page 6, Chapter 16, page 297.
So Joseph was against paper money.
Yeah. And then let me define something here. This is Black's Law Dictionary. Money changers. A money changer is one whose occupation is exchanging of kinds of denomination of currency, and the common meaning of the term pertaining to those persons who in early history engaged in the business of foreign exchange, and includes the business of a banker and buying and selling of uncurrent funds and exchange of one kind of money for another. Okay, Black's Law Dictionary, 6th edition, page 1005. And again, verily I say unto you, let all my servants in the land of Kirtland remember the Lord their God, and my house also to keep and preserve it holy, and to overthrow the money changers in my own due time, saith the Lord. D&C 117:16.
Wow. Whew, well, that covered that pretty well.
Yeah. Tells you what you're supposed to do.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Get rid of the money changers.
Mhm. Now we'll go on. Okay, let me look at something here real quick. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to bring this one up. Okay, Communist Manifesto Principle 6, government owns communications and transportation systems. Okay, God's endowed memo, certain unalienable rights, and no legislation, no majority, however great, may morally limit or destroy these. The function of government is to protect life, liberty, and property. Anything more or less than this is usurpation, and oppression. President Benson, Congress Report, 1968. You probably have noticed, most people have, that the major networks, news organizations, everything else basically run the same story.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't change much. So in this case, it's not the government that quote unquote owns them, but the Federal Reserve has all kinds of money. So they basically, through one corporation, own all of them and operate all of them. So I'm going to give you an example. My mother, back in I think well, it was 1916, late 1959, 1960, married a fellow named John B. Edwards. And I was at the time 12, 13, something like that. And he was a reporter for ABC and covered the White House. That's why I wound up living in DC and in Virginia. And so he would travel on the presidential press plane or with the president, whichever. And his best friend was Jack Sutherland. Jack Sutherland and I kind of hit it off. I mean, I was just a little snot-nosed kid, but Jack kind of liked me for some reason. One of the last times I was in DC was probably in the 80s sometime, a few years before Jack died. And he had been an infantry officer, fought in the Aleutians. He had worked for U.S. News and World Report and covered the White House for years. So, and he also wrote for the Wall Street Journal. And he wrote a couple of books on war. He wrote one on Napoleon, and he was working one on Korea when he died. Now, you couldn't get much better credentials than that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the 1980s. I'm back in DC. Jack invites me out for lunch, the King's Club. He said he went to Vietnam. We were discussing all this. And he said, so I came back and I wrote what I saw. He said they changed everything he wrote. They totally disgusted him. And here's a man with some of the best credentials in the country you can come up with. And they changed his report because they didn't like the way he wrote it.
Hmm. Wow.
Anyone who wants to go look up my his kind of stepfather, John B. Edwards, can look up the last of the Nixon Kennedy reports. He's the guy with the big head and the big horn and glasses, and the hair slicked back.
Gotcha.
And he's on the Nixon Kennedy debates.
Wow.
So, and I've got a picture there of my mother, an invite from Mamie Eisenhower to lunch because she was, they're bribing all the press wives.
Right.
But I got a picture of her in front of the White House.
Wow, that's awesome.
So when I was in the White House, when I was like 13, 14, in the press area and around.
Right.
So.
Well, very cool. So with this here, where they control communication and transportation systems, this gets problematic because they get to dictate the message.
Exactly.
Right. And this is where that First Amendment, those First Amendment rights become hugely important. Because here's the thing. The speech that needs protected, Phil, is the speech you disagree with. Because at some point, the shoe will be on the other foot, and the speech that you're saying will need to be protected.
Yes.
And so this is why I am willing to take the heat I am with the podcast, right? Because people will call me and say, gosh, should you be talking to that guy? And my answer is always the same. The solution to speech you don't agree with isn't less speech, it's more speech.
Exactly.
You want those guys talking. The other thing is that if there's a bad actor out there, they can't help but tell you what they want to do.
Yeah.
Right. And so the more the time they have on a microphone, the better off they're going to be. And so when someone comes along and says, well, do you agree with that guy? No. Well, then why are you letting him talk? Because I want to know who he is.
Exactly.
And I want to know what he's about. And at some point, his speech should totally be protected, even though I disagree with it entirely. As long as he's not making threats, I'm okay. Right? You know, that sort of thing, then we get into something else. Other than that, tell me about your bad ideas all day long, please.
Yes.
Right? And at some point, I will need that same protection when someone doesn't like what I have to say. And so when the government gets involved and starts tailoring the message to what they see fit, what is most politically correct and expedient, that's when you should worry.
Oh, yeah.
And
And they've been doing that for a long time.
And we saw that with COVID, especially, right?
Yes.
If you dared speak out that, hey, maybe this thing got made in a lab, you were off YouTube, you were off Facebook,
If
you
it-
were off all the
Yeah,
platforms.
if you thought hydroxychloroquine would cure, you were done.
Right, ivermectin,
Regardless,
right.
whatever, regardless what it was. And that's because they're pushing an agenda. They want this, okay? Just why did the mayor of New York not get executed for murder? Because he put all those old folks in a home
Yep.
together, and many of them died. The things they did were so horrible that it boggles the mind, but people put up with it. Just like, you know, in New York, they're shutting down the Jewish synagogues and stuff, but letting people run rampant in the streets without
Yep.
masks and stuff. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. If you're going to shut this guy down for his religious belief, because he's lacking a religion, regardless of which religion it is, then you need to shut these other people down too.
Well, I think the better answer would be like, you don't get to shut anybody down, right? I mean,
Well, here, I'm going to disagree with you somewhat in that if you're in the streets rioting,
sure.
you need to be shut down. There's
Okay.
a difference between a protest and a riot. And here's my thing on that. And it's simply this. You have the right to protest. You have the right to say whatever you want to say, okay? Except you can't call fire in a crowded theater if there's no fire. You know, you can't because you're putting people's lives in danger. You cannot block the freeway because you're blocking somebody else's right to travel. Cannot do that. You cannot threaten or intimidate somebody's customers coming into a store. Whether you like the store or don't like the store, doesn't matter. I don't care what they are. You cannot, you know, block the entrance. You cannot take over the entire park so that people can't enjoy it. You can't make their enjoyment of the park because it's a public place miserable because you're there, you know, having drugs or whatever.
Okay, can I play devil's advocate and push back on that?
Sure.
How would you get around the Boston Tea Party then?
Okay, now the Boston Tea Party was a protest.
Was it a protest? Because they damaged stuff.
Yeah, they did. They damaged tea, and I can see, and you know, again, it is a problem, and it probably wasn't the best way to solution, but I understand what they did. And you're damaging the property of the people who are damaging you.
Okay.
All right.
Except for the fact that nobody could buy tea at that point.
Yeah.
So if somebody you see where I'm going here? We get this is a settled line. This is not as stark a line as what we wish.
It's difficult because we hold those people in high regard, and they got the British tea, and we went drinking coffee and yada yada yada. But to me, like Ferguson, that was complete stupidity.
Yes.
But it was planned. I mean,
Yes.
the people who participated in that also participated in some of the stuff going on in Baltimore and et cetera, recognize some of the same people. And that's where the whole line of Black Lives Matter came out.
Right.
Because Black Lives Matter. Well, I've got a whole thing in my computer about how many black people died after some of these George Floyd things and stuff
Right.
like that. Because your riots caused this number of people, white and black, to die.
Right.
You burned down all these black businesses.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Absolutely, they did.
And there's a difference to my mind between throwing tea in the Boston party and burning somebody's house to the ground.
I would agree with that. Maybe the guy whose tea got thrown into a harbor, not so much.
No, he's probably upset about it. I'm sure
Right?
he
Because
was.
would that not impact his livelihood as
Oh
well?
yeah,
All
but
I'm
that
saying,
that was, and that actually probably didn't hurt them hardly at all, because that was the British, what the hell they call it? It was a British company that owned almost
East India
everything.
Trading
East Indian
Company.
Trade, yeah, they owned almost everything at the time. And so one shipload of tea probably didn't hurt them. We got the point.
Here's what I've said on this, on several times. One, let's go back to what were originally saying. I don't want any religion shut down, right? I feel like if we shut down a religion, an entire religion, we're in some trouble, because, like it or not, that's what they did to the Mormons.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Right? That's what Missouri did to the Mormons in the 1800s. Just shut it down, and we saw how that ended. However, you have to deal with facts on the ground as they are and say, okay, Islam has a problem with terrorism, right?
Yep.
But you can't shut down the entire religion. You now have to go after the bad actors, right?
Correct.
And so my thought is on this, you got to shut down the bad actors, right? Not the religion, the bad actors.
Well, and I'm going to say free speech has a lot to do with that.
Right.
And that's what you don't have in the Muslim country.
Exactly.
You cannot say what you want to say.
Exactly.
Being, imprisoned, executed, whatever. And so that, to
When
me,
you're
shows the fault.
Yes, 100%. When the speech is protected, you can have reformers. Without
Protected speech, there are no reformers.
There are no reformers. Right. And so that's why that First Amendment becomes so huge. And that's why government interference of that and the takeover of the media and that sort of thing is so damaging, because now you're able to control the population through the narrative. Now, we then get into some fairly dicey area today that I'm guessing that when most of these quotes were taken hadn't even become a thought yet, and that is Facebook a private company or not? Because if it's a private company, they can at any time decide that's too spicy, you don't get to put that there. If it's a utility, a public utility, well, then it's different. Then it's the town square.
And that's where the Congress, to me, has fallen down. They have made companies like Facebook a public utility, but they haven't disciplined them by forcing them to let anything go through,
Right.
because you have the protections of a public utility. So they can't, as a public utility, they can't be sued.
Right.
But they can't stop anybody from saying anything.
Right.
So what happens now is when they're acting as a publisher, okay, now they're responsible for what goes out. So theoretically, Facebook could be sued off the face of the earth because you shut down people who are telling the truth about COVID, but you can't, but they can't be sued because they're a public company. Right. So they're getting the benefit of both of these, and Congress has not done their job, and that would be one of the things I would change in a heartbeat.
Yep. Yeah, no, and we're seeing this play out real time in Canada, especially with, they're really coming after podcasters hard up in Canada now, right? They're like, there's some guys who shouldn't be allowed to have a voice. And that's gonna get spooky, because then all of a sudden there's no dissent from the public message, right? The message put out by the government.
And because the government up there, like in England, controls pretty much all the media.
Yep.
You can't put stuff on.
That's exactly right.
Then they want to shut down the podcasters. Interestingly enough, Trudeau looks an awful lot like Castro.
It does. Yeah. I've heard about this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay.
So let's see, and the thing with transportation, I'll just go that. That's what they're doing in China right now. If you don't
Mm-hmm.
meet our public, public perceptions or stuff, you can't go, you can't travel.
Right.
We shut down your ability to go
Their
visit.
social credit scores. Yeah.
Yeah. So and what's interesting, I find, and I would have some real serious and very, I say serious, be unpleasant talks with Google and all these companies for helping China do that.
Right. No, 100%.
Because even though you may not be impacting people here at the moment, you're getting prepped to do that. And two, you're destroying people's lives over
Absolutely.
there.
Yep.
And you're responsible for that. And you're giving, yeah. Okay, here's one on the press. There is no such thing as an independent press in America. Not a man among you dares utter his honest opinion. You know beforehand that it would never appear in print. It's the duty of the New York journalist to lie, to reveal today to the at the feet to toady at the feet of Mammon, and to sell his country and his race for his daily bread. We are the tools and the vassals of the rich behind the scenes. We are marionettes. These men pull the strings, we dance. Our time, our talents, our lives, and our capabilities are all at the property of these men. We're intellectual prostitutes. John Swinton, editor of the New York Times, American Press, 1954. Okay, how did this come about? March 1915, J.P. Morgan interests got together 12 men high up in the newspaper world and employed them to select the most influential papers in the United States, and sufficient number of them to control generally the public policy and daily press of the U.S. These 12 men worked the problem out, selecting 179 newspapers, and then began the elimination process to retain only those necessary for the purpose of controlling. They found necessary to purchase control of 25 of the greatest papers. An editor was furnished for each paper to properly supervise and edit information regarding the questions of preparedness, militarism, financial policies, and other things of national, international nature considered vital to the interests of the purchasers. Congressman Oscar Callaway, Congressional Record, February 9th, 1917. Did this work for the purchasers? We're grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meeting and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright light of public publicity during these years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supranational sovereignty of an intellectual light and world bankers is surely preferable to national auto-determination practice in past centuries. David Rockefeller, Council for Relations and DC's international banker, speaking at the Bilderbergers Conference, June 1991 in Germany.
So they just admit it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And see, this goes back to the Federal Reserve. How they purchased. They did this in 1917, right? 4 years after they created the Federal Reserve.
Yep. They just took the money.
They just took them, they just
made the money.
made the money and bought it.
Yep. Absolutely.
And that's the danger.
Right. Absolutely. And that's why I'm not a fan of like, PBR, that sort of stuff. Right.
Oh, public broadcasting system.
Yeah.
They're
PBS.
paid
Excuse
for.
me. Yeah. Absolutely. That's why I'm not a big believer in them.
So, Principle 7, government owns factories and farms.
I think we kind of reviewed that one with
Property.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
It controls the means of production, right?
yeah, and what do you do at that point?
Right, you're done.
You're done. It's go back to 1930s when they went through all farms, started killing off animals and stuff because they wanted to lower the price of meat.
Yep.
Well, that made it harder for everybody else.
Absolutely, it did. Yep.
And you're in the middle of the depression, and now meat's more expensive.
Right. Yeah, 100%.
So that's so Communist Manifesto Principle 8, government controls labor. Thou shalt eat the labor of thy hands. Happy shall I be, and it shall be well with thee. Psalms 128. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. Genesis 3:19. For even when we were with you, this we command you, that if any would not work, neither should we eat, neither should he eat. And thou shalt not be idle, for he is idle shall not eat the bread of the, nor wear the garments of labor. Doctrine and Covenants 42:42. So when I say here, my ability to use my labor to produce goods or to hire out as I see fit is a God-given right that the government has trampled in the name of individual rights. An individual does not have a right to eat at the expense of others. An individual has an equal right to labor, and from the labor comes the right to do with his wages whatever he feels proper. If he chooses to starve, that is his business. We have no right to deny him that his choice. We have a responsibility to discourage him, but no right to deny him.
Okay. The government's ability to control labor is huge,
Yes.
right? Because one of the things that happened in America, as far as I can tell, and this is going to sound kind of bad on the surface, so let me explain, is that for the first time in man's history, mankind was kind of let off the chain, right? You go create whatever it is, and whether you succeed or fail, you get to reap the benefits of that.
Exactly.
Right? And what we saw out of that is a machine like we have never witnessed in human history. Skousen puts it best. The first 5,000 years of man's existence, how's man getting from point A to point B? You really got two options.
Feet or hoof.
Yes, a feet or a hoof. That's it. Now, America comes along, and just about 100 years later, just under actually, we're connecting the continent with railroads. Literally less than 100 years after that, or just at 100 years, we land a dude on the moon, right? Now, what happens in that short 200-year span of time? Well, mankind finally gets to be able to reap the benefits of his own labor, right? And now mankind has a new incentive to create, right?
Well,
and it's just not that, right?
Get the rewards of your creation.
Yes. And not just scientific advancements, right? The standard of living we know now is unfathomable to the bulk
of people,
the entirety, the entirety of human history, right? We live better now than most all monarchs did, 200-300 years ago.
I mean, I can go here in the middle of Missouri and I can get fish from the Atlantic anytime I want.
Yep.
And they couldn't dream of that in those days.
And this all comes from mankind being able to reap the benefits of his hard work. The other thing, there's this idea that there's only this much pie, right? And so,
well, that's BS.
But that's BS because this system taught everybody, oh, you can create wealth.
You can create more pie.
Right.
That's the problem with the socialists. They say that just this much pie, so we're going to divide it up. The capitalists say,
we'll just make more pie.
More pie.
Right. Yeah.
And you talk about advances. Here's my favorite. Laura Ingalls Wilder.
Right.
Came across into Missouri on a covered wagon. Her last trip cross country was a 707.
Yep.
Think of the difference.
Yep. Or just the phone that you carry around your pocket has more computing power than the first computer that landed a man on the moon.
Well, I just think I remember being in my kitchen when I was 10, 11, and it was a big thing to have a phone with long cords. You could walk around and do stuff. And now we got cell phones,
right?
That are computers that are, like I say, better than what we landed on the moon with.
To me, the controlling of man's labor is as important as any of these other principles we've just talked about. Because without it, we just stop innovating. And then once we stop, I look at the times we live in now, Phil, and I'm like, if we cannot just screw ourselves up for maybe another 10 years, I have no doubts we're going to cure cancer. Right? but we keep screwing ourselves over. And I'm like, we're going to take this golden age and we're going to flush it right down the toilet.
Well, here's the thing. You got organizations like the American Medical Association who wants to control how many doctors we have and what medicines you can use.
Right.
And I say no. Yeah, you're going to have some quacks. Yeah, you're going to have some people die, but you can also find out stuff that works.
Mm-hmm. And look, if you're on your deathbed,
You don't care.
and you know, if you're in your 40s and you got a crack at living 80 years longer, right? You're gonna die if you don't take it for sure. Why not give that dude a chance, right? Why not let him take the risk?
Let him take the risk. Now, I think that I'm a favor of guilds, not labor unions, but guilds, in that they can't control who makes stuff. But I'm just saying, for a labor union, you cannot control who works at that labor site. But if you hire my labor guy, I guarantee you that he is extremely proficient at everything, and you'll do better than the average Joe schmuck down the street.
Right.
And so now you're competitive. I can hire Joe schmuck down the street and pay him $10 an hour. I can pay $20 an hour to this guy from the union who's extremely proficient and will do better than twice the work. Who are you going to hire? You're going to hire the union guy.
Except for the fact the unions come with their own level of bureaucracy.
Well, that's what I'm saying. You have to limit them. They cannot make it impossible. I was forced to be a member of the union, pilots union. They didn't do me damn bit of good when trouble hit. But we had to, because, well, you didn't have to join the union, but you had to pay their dues.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if I'm going to pay dues, I'm going to be a voting member.
Right.
That's just the way it is. And so, yeah, they come with their own bureaucracy. I would say you can't force somebody to be a union member or to force the company to hire union people. That's BS. But you can make sure that your union members are highly proficient, and it's worth their time and trouble to contribute to your organization, because you're going to get more job opportunities because we are more efficient.
The only problem with that I see is that you have labor unions like AFL-CIO that will proudly tell you we stand with Socialist Party USA.
Oh yeah.
Right. And so they're riddled with that kind of corruption.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing is that, and this is my experience, right? Just mine. So I'm just speaking from personal experience. As a surveyor, what I've discovered is that if I hired a surveyor out of the union hall or wherever, that dude didn't give me a good day's work, because he had so many mandatory breaks, and there were so many things that we had to jump through to be able to be proficient. It was my experience that, at least in my career, I had found that the unions were often a hedge.
I agree. Mostly what I like I said, when I had an issue, they weren't worth crap to help me.
Yeah, I remember there was a guy that worked for us who was a union guy. Two of them. One guy sucked. The other guy was great. And I was like, I want to give that guy a raise. And so I went into HR and I said, hey, I want to give John a raise here. So we can't give John a raise without giving Ken a raise. Well, why is that? Well, because they're both union and they're both pegged to the same pay rate. But John does a better job and Ken just turns coffee into piss all day. I can't, what can, and so it was frustrating, because there was a guy I wanted to fire that I couldn't, and there was a guy I wanted to promote and I couldn't.
Yeah, and that's where unions totally fail.
Yeah,
and they've got to get rid of that kind of attitude. Again, I say, I'm not going to say you can't have a union. I'm going to say, one, and no union can give any money to any, and this goes corporations, because corporations unions all exist as the purveyors of the government. Therefore, they cannot give any money to any politician at any time for any reason.
Yep.
Period. And done. You can't do that. So that takes all their political sting out of it. Two, you can't make a contract that says you have to be union only.
Right.
So like in your case, your guy could have gone, well, I can get a promotion if I get out of the union, so I'm gonna go over here. The union wouldn't take very long for them to stop that bullshit. It's just like in Hollywood. Most of these Hollywood movies are made overseas now, or a lot of them are, because their unions are so
Yep.
damn expensive. And what makes them really doubly expensive is if you're a lighting guy, you can't work sound.
Right.
If you're a prop guy, you can't work sound
Yep.
or electric. So that to me is BS. I was stage manager in high school, and we did a little bit of everything, and it worked. And with the union thing and their you know rules and crap, you have to hire 6 or 8 people when 3 or 4 probably would work
Absolutely.
and save you half of your labor costs in producing the movie,
Absolutely.
and you're ahead of the game. But you're just making everything more expensive, and so it makes it more expensive for the guy down the road.
Right.
More expensive for the moviegoer, more expensive for the producer, everything.
Well, the other thing is that communism requires
Labor
that labor is in disagreement
with the management.
with management or capital, right? Labor and capital can never have a meeting of the minds, right? In order for communism to gain a foothold, even, it has to be viewed that capital is exploiting labor, not it can't exist.
Under communism, there's only the exploiter and the exploitee.
Right.
That's it.
And that's how they and this is one of the ways again that communism can limit production and make people more reliant on the government, right?
Yeah.
And then paint it as a failure of capital.
Yeah, well, and they always go and look at capital it doesn't matter. But what you're doing when you have capital is I have saved up my labor because
Yep.
I've worked for this, I've put this away, and now I want to put my labor that I saved to work.
Well, really to risk, right? I mean,
Well, yeah, when you do that, you're putting it at risk.
yeah,
You're taking a risk. I have to laugh, but it's sad at some of these kids going, well, we're labor, we should have the same as the owner. No, you're not at risk.
no,
You show up, you get so much an hour, and that's it. You think you should create something here, but that's up to the owner. If he likes what you do, fine. If he doesn't, he's not going to support it because it's his money.
yep,
It's his risk.
yep,
It's his labor. It's all his. And the difference between the entrepreneur in many cases and this labor guy is a labor guy went out, and I've seen this myself, and had a couple of beers every night and had a steak dinner and blah blah blah. And the other guy had hot dogs and stuff and saved his money so he could do something with it later. My mother was telling me, and this was a black situation, but it applies to anybody. In DC, this is like 1961 or 2, someplace in there. Once these blacks got together and they bought a Cadillac, and they take turns driving around town looking good. And I'm thinking to myself, of course, I was raised in a family that started their own business. Why would you not take that same money for that Cadillac and buy the corner liquor store or corner convenience store, and all you get together and work that? Okay, you're not going to look good. It's going to be effort. But if you all get together and work, and share wages and stuff, and you will own the store eventually after the down payment's paid, and then you can buy another store, and then another store. And pretty
right,
soon you can all buy your own damn Cadillac, so you don't have to share.
right. Well, it's a matter of being taught those principles, right? I
Yeah.
mean, that's just all there is to it. But
Yeah,
good stuff.
that's kind of where it is. So that's Frederick Bastiat, 1848. The state is a fictitious enemy which entity, which everyone seeks to live at the expense of everyone else.
That is a true statement. That is a true statement. Excuse me.
Helping the poor through government is like feeding the sparrows through the horses.
Right.
When government is the only agency to take a useful commodity like paper, slap some ink on it, make it totally worthless. Okay, when speaking of government, helping the family, a prophet said, and this is Spencer W. Kimball, whether from inadvertence, ignorance, or other causes, the efforts of government often make sometimes only hurt the family more. There are those who would define the family out of existence. The more governments try in vain to take the place of the family, the less effective governments will be in performing the basic roles for which government are formed in the first place.
Principle 9.
And elected farms, regional planning. And we've kind of gone over that.
Yep, we have.
You know, that's the
More cradle to grave kind of planning.
Yeah. We're gonna take over, we're gonna tell you what to plant.
Yep.
And the problem is you're gonna have some damn bureaucrat out there.
Yep.
Who never rode a hoe weed his life, tell them you gotta produce so many tons of wheat. Well, yeah, maybe they can, maybe they can't. But under your system, it's really difficult because we didn't buy enough tractors this year, so you're gonna do everything by hand, or we didn't do this, or the tractor broke, but we don't have any funds. We didn't anticipate that, so we don't have any funds to fix it. And nobody gives a shit. If you break down a tractor here in my place, okay, I'm gonna find a way to fix it.
Right.
You know, I mean, I can't tell you, I've made tools with my lathe. I've done all kinds of crazy stuff to keep things running. And if you're not gonna make any money on that, tractor broke, the hell with it, let it sit. I don't care.
I got something I want to say on this, but I want to make sure it doesn't fit into the next section. What's the 10th principle?
Public education for all kids.
I think I can do it here. This would be better. All right. This goes when me and Amber were adopting our twins. They called us. I got the call in Maryland. I was still living in Maryland at the time, and the twins were born in Boise. And they basically say, look, you're the only one that's financially viable. You're the only one who's responsible enough to take these twins in your family. If you don't want them, we're going to split them up. And I was like, well, that's not happening. Let me go talk to my wife and I'll call you back. And called them back 15 minutes later and said, yeah, we'll take them. They said, well, you'll have to relocate back to Boise. I'm like, yes, I'm well aware. And so we get it done. We move back to Boise and we get the twins in our home, but then they're like, okay, now we already have 4 kids by the time we adopt the twins. Okay. And they say, you need to be foster parents. Okay, fine. How do I become a foster parent? Well, you got to sit through our course. So I go in and I listen to a dude who never had kids, doesn't want kids, tell me how to be a better parent. Okay, whatever. I'll play your game.
Yeah.
We finally get through all the process. My sister's rights gets terminated, so now we can adopt the kids, right? Everything's finally where it needs to be. But they're dragging their feet, right? Because I need them to take it from foster care, these 2 files, from foster care to permanent placement, right? Just down the hall, just move that file. And they're like, oh, we're just so busy, I haven't had a chance yet. This goes on for 6 months. 6 months, Phil. Now, when you're a foster parent, you can't take the kids out of the county, right? You need a waiver. Or if you're not granted a waiver, you got to leave them at some other foster parent's house while you go do it. Well, we've already bonded with these kids. And I was like, I'll be damned if I'm going to drop them off at somebody else's house. Right? So finally, I get fed up. I'm like, I call them one day. I'm like, you need to move the files from foster care to permanent placement. She's like, sir, I know you're frustrated, but I'm just too busy. And I'm like, tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to pay my secretary, who makes way more than you to go down and move those files. And she goes, well, that won't work because there's sensitive information. I was like, then I will come down on my lunch break. I will grab those 2 files and I will walk my happy ass down the hall and drop them in the appropriate office with permanent placement. She said, I'll have your case manager call you back. I'm like, that sounds fantastic. Within 10 minutes, I get a call back. This case manager is stammering and stuttering. And I'm like, get me your manager now because something's up. I get a call from her manager. And she said, Mr. Sanders, I can't tell you how grateful we've been for your family that you have stepped in and you've taken on these 2 twins for the past year and they're thriving. But we really think since you already have 4 kids that 6 might be overwhelming. So now we're going to look at maybe other families who might be more equipped to take care of these 2 twins. And at that point, I promptly got an attorney and the nastiest, meanest one I could find. And I'll be damned if when he said he, was going to go public, they didn't just move the files to permanent placement. They moved it to an outside adoption agency to get it done. But I wasn't done. I wanted to know what was going on. The central planning thing, this collective planning, goes far, far beyond just farms and just factories. If you read Marx, he tells you one of the things we have to get rid of is the nuclear family, right? Yeah. Children are state property. And as such, the parents can't have that. And it's my opinion. I think most logical people could see that this wasn't about what was doing right by the kids. This was about central planning. This was about there's some kid that sat in school way too long, absorbed a bunch of stuff, never raised a kid of his own, and then decides what's best for him. So when we start talking about central planning, it goes into more than just farms and factories. This goes to the very building block of what societies are, right, which are families.
Which is Hillary Clinton's "it takes a village" bullshit.
Yeah, no, it doesn't take a village, Hill. It just takes you staying out of my living room and I'll take it from there.
Exactly. And that's the whole thing. That's why you're getting all this stuff now with the transgender stuff and everything else. They've been working for years at, and I'm going to take this back and people will probably be upset, but I don't care. Goes back for a long time. Satan has worked his best to limit the number of people who are born and who are okay. And the Catholic Church, originally all their priests were married,
right?
But they got tired of the arguments. Well, the priest died, the wife owns the property. No, you don't. Church owns the property. No, the wife owns the property. Blah blah blah, back and forth. So they had them, not be married anymore. So look at all the priests and nuns who could have produced children, which is the first commandment,
and never did.
And never did. So that's to me, that's just kind of the start of it. Yep. Now you're doing this whole thing. Is the purpose to fix these people's gender dysphoria, or is it to destroy them so they can't make kids?
Now, I think it's a little.
You start cutting off parts and pieces, you're not going to be able to produce.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That's what it's about. And that's part of the population control, part of the whole communist thing. I kind of got a kick out of Georgia Guidestones. It's only fine blew them damn things up.
Yeah.
But the world population is supposed to drop to like 500,000 or something, or 500 million from 14 billion. So you're willing, or from 7 billion. So you're willing to kill 13 out of 14 people to get what you want.
Yep. Absolutely. Which kind of leads into this next section, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Government education for all children. And I'm going to, let's see, where is it? Oh, okay. Let's see.
If I'm not mistaken, my boy Brigham Young had some things to say about this.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll find it. But let me read this. This is from Bank of America. Democracy has ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention. have ever been found incompatible with personal security for the rights of property, and in general been as short-lived as their lives as they have violent in their deaths. Theoretic politicians who have patronized this species of government are honestly supposed that by reducing mankind to perfect equity in their political rights, they will at the same time be perfectly equalized and assimilate their possessions, their opinions, and their passions. The problem you've got is that people are very easily persuaded. And so if you have a pure democracy, I can persuade the majority of people.
It's mob rule.
And it's mob rule. And, you know, all these, I especially get a kind of kick out of some of these black leaders who, this is a democracy. If it were a democracy, we could have eliminated you a long time ago.
Yeah.
But in a republic,
the wheels are slowed down.
Well, the wheels are slowed down. In a republic, if you really run one the way it's supposed to be, we understand the rights of each individual, regardless of the skin color, regardless of how they, what their religion and everything else. You have a right to life, you have a right to liberty and property and all those things, all the things guaranteed by the Constitution. I can't take them away. It doesn't matter. I went back to my table saw thing. It doesn't matter what it is. You have a right to that to make your living, to do what you want to do. And we can't take that away from you.
Mm-hmm.
So all these laws that say, oh, we can tax your car. Well, no, because I can see where you can, you know, have a license plate for tracking vehicles and stuff. I don't have a problem with that, but it's the cost of the license plate, and it should last for several years, and then you change out, and that's it. It's just like taxes on gasoline. That should be for roads, bridges, and the end of it, and that's the end of it. And that's the end of the thing. It's for that, and everyone has equal access. But if you, this used to piss me off to no end. I had a dump truck, and I would go from the rock yard, and you could drive through this one neighborhood, and it took about 5 or 10 miles off the trip. They started putting up signs: you can't have a dump truck through my neighborhood. Blah blah blah. My damn tax! I pay a hell lot more taxes on a dump truck for fuel than you do.
Right.
I'm paying a lot more for your roads than you are. Why are you keeping me out of it? Because you don't like the roll of the dump truck? Well, how much inconvenience and how much more if you're an environmentalist? Now I've got to run another 10 miles a truck that gets 6 miles a gallon. How much more is this going to hurt the environment? You know, if you're really that liberal, and I always ran the thing about cars. If everyone has their way, the guy's going to say, well, that dump truck's too loud and too noisy. You can't drive that. And then somebody else can say, well, your car is too small. It doesn't haul enough people, so you can't drive that. And your car is too big. It runs too much gasoline. Pretty soon, nobody's going anywhere.
Right.
Because you all get your own little pet little peeves. The reality is, I've got a truck out here. It's got a dump bed on it. That saves me a lot of grief being able to run that. I don't have to call somebody for if I need 2 yards of rock or something. I can just go get it. But you know, somebody else, they want to run it around a Volkswagen. That's fine. I don't care. Do what you want to do. Run your Prius if you want to. You know, it doesn't matter to me. It's bad when you make electric vehicles mandatory. And the funny thing is Ford stopped making them.
Yeah.
They can't sell enough. They're losing their ass. And this is a government mandated thing by somebody who doesn't know, pardon the expression, shit from Shinola about vehicles and stuff and what people want. I talked to Mercedes the other day, and they're having a hard time selling their damn pure electric vehicles because nobody wants them.
Yep.
Why? Well, first off, you got to make electricity from something.
Right.
Battery technology is not there to the point where you can go a long ways with the vehicle, a couple hundred miles, and that's about it. That's not worth a trip. I drive down to Texas to see my kids. You know, we're driving 300-400 miles. You can't do that in an electric vehicle.
Right.
You know, and so all this stuff just doesn't work. But somebody up there was, oh, well, we're going to get everyone. They're going to, and this is part of the whole. I don't know if you remember Agenda 21.
Yep.
Okay, so that's the whole thing of we're going to put everyone in the city, and that doesn't work because the farmers need to be next to the farm,
Yeah.
you know. I like I got some property here, but we're making use of it. The fact that I may not make use of it as you do is none of your damn business.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. All right.
So now we're on this here. Okay. This is Soldiers Training Manual issued by the War Department, November 30th, 1928. And it set forth the truth and definition of democracy and of a republic. Democracy, a government of the masses. Authority derived through mass meeting or any other form of direct expression results in mobocracy. Attitude towards property is communistic, negating property rights. Attitude towards law is that the will of the majority should regulate, whether it be based upon deliberation or governed by passion, prejudice, or impulse, without restraining regard to consequences. Results in demagogism, license, agitation, discomfort, and anarchy. Republic. Authority is derived through the election of people over republic of public officials best fitted to represent them. Attitude toward property is respect for laws and individual rights and a sensible economic procedure. Attitude towards law is administration of justice in accordance with fixed principles and established evidence with a strict regard for consequences. A greater number of citizens and extent of territory may be brought within its compass. Avoids the dangerous extreme, either tyranny or mobocracy, results in stateship, liberty, reason, justice, contentment, and progress. So this is supposed to be a republic, and it just pisses me off to no end how many people refer to this as democracy, because it's not. By as basic, it is a republic, and if you don't understand the difference, you're gonna have a mess in your hands.
Right. I should point out here that what you're talking about here is what the kids are being taught now, right?
Yeah.
They're being taught we're a democracy, not a republic, and you're drawing that comparison. Um, the early brethren within Mormonism, and let me we should probably go back here and talk about some of the other problems we're seeing with public education, right? It's not education like we think of, right?
No, it's
They're not
indoctrination.
they're not being taught how to think critically. They're being taught what to think,
Exactly.
right? And so what happens is that they become indoctrination centers more than schools.
Yeah.
Now, the early brethren in Mormonism, they didn't like the idea of public schools, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, okay. When you read about the change after the manifesto, one of the things they did is they got rid of the Mormon schools.
Mm-hmm.
They kept the university, but got rid of the schools and made them public schools. People didn't realize what a
Right.
boondoggle that was. That was one of the biggest problems I had with my ex-wife and one of my daughters was I was trying to explain to them that the Book of Mormon says have no one be your teacher, someone believes like you do, and believes in your same things. Well, public schools are fine, blah, blah. Well, look at the public schools today.
Right.
They're a mess. And most of the teachers don't even know because they've been indoctrinated.
Right.
Colleges and stuff. So here, let me go through some quotes here. Parents don't mean to be incompetent, but they are. And remedy is federal establishment of acceptable standards of child raising. German White, U.S. Office of Child Development, Review of the News, 310/76. By the year 2000, we'll raise our children to believe in human potential, not God. Gloria Steinman, Chatter Review, Education, 1973. It is absurd to say that one is a humanist, but not a feminist. Feminism is the last evolution development of humanism. Feminism and humanism on its most advanced level. Ryan Esther, Humanist Magazine. Humanism is the denial of God and the total affirmation of man. Humanism is nothing but Marxism. Karl Marx, Etiquette on Philosophy. Trust no one to be your teacher nor your minister, except to be a man of God, walking his ways and keeping his commandments. Mosiah 23:14. I am as opposed to free education, much as I'm opposed to taking property from one man and giving it to another who knows not how to take care of it. I am for the real act of doing it and not saying, would I encourage free schools by taxation? No. Brigham Young, Journal of Discourses, The
Yeah.
Christian world has actually come to the point that they will dismiss the Bible from our schools and by and by will dismiss it from the pulpits and get one to suit themselves. They'll hew out for themselves cisterns that will hold no water. Brigham Young.
Boy, he was
Discourses.
right on that one.
Yeah. If you want to pauperize a community, Ben by giving them something they've never earned. The government owns to the child schooling and also owned by parity of reasoning owes to it food and clothing at public expense. If you want to destroy a child's mind and that feeling of energy, self-respect, and self-reliance, which all should have, you would impress upon him that the state government owes him something on which he can depend.
And it just kind of goes on and on, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And again, we don't want to spoil a book for anybody. Okay, so we just went through 10 principles here, right? And we compared them with these 10 principles found in the manifest in the Communist Manifesto, and then compared them to what good government is, and then what early church brethren have been. Now we've been at this now for about 3 hours.
That long?
Yeah. Yep. So I don't want to give away any more of the book. So let me ask you this. How do you fix all this?
Well, first off, you have to have an educated public, which they've done their best to de-educate everybody. I mean,
Right.
I remember when I went to school in Virginia, we read a Bible verse every morning.
Right.
Said the Pledge of Allegiance. They've slowly just taken all that out. And it's like boiling a frog in the water.
Right.
You know, it's that. I think it's going to take some intervention from the Lord, from people who know what they're doing.
Yeah. I so often I've thought about this a lot. I'm a guy who likes to look forward to find the answers to problems. However, there's sometimes we just need to look back, right? There's a principle within surveying called latitudes and departures, right? Which says that if you're starting from a fixed point, a known point, and you want to go on a bearing, right, for say thousands of miles, right? And you're off by a second of a degree.
Could be off way the hell at the end.
Yeah. At the beginning, you don't notice any difference, right? I mean, it's, you go out a mile, you're not going to see any difference. You go out 2 miles, you're really not seeing any difference. Maybe at about 500 miles, you start noticing something's not right. And then by the time you get to 1,000 miles, well, now all of a sudden you've missed your target by thousands of feet, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we are, I think, in the country, right? Is that we keep looking forward for answers, and that's good. We should look for answers everywhere, but it doesn't matter what heading we're on, and if we can't look back and get our bearings, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes we have to go back and say, okay, let's look at the point of departure, get back to that, and then course correct so we can be on a sufficient course. Now, with these latitudes and departures, you don't have to go all the way to the beginning. What you need to do is you need to look back to the beginning and then
where you're supposed to be
and figure out where you were supposed to be and then get back on that track, right?
Yeah.
And so I don't think we have to tear this all down, right? That's something else people will say. Let's just burn it down. I'm like, no, don't burn this down. This is all screwed up, but it has been the most stable for the last couple hundred years. Let's just make a course correction and get back on track, right? And that's the point I want to get to is just telling people, I know it seems daunting, but everything in me says this isn't something we have to burn down the system for. This is just something we have to make a few course corrections and we'll be back on track.
Yeah, I think if I were to make a course. Yeah, there's just another point I wanted to make. These folks who are kind of driving the train have been doing this for centuries. And their favorite thing is to pit people against one another. They do that for a variety of ways, but it's kind of a poor example. Imagine the Civil War, and you want to start a war between the states because that's how you make your money. You finance both sides. They've been doing Rothschilds and folks have been doing this for years. So you send a guy with a little bit of money down to, we'll say, North Carolina, and he gets friendly with the artillery battery commander there, and he convinces that guy, you should be able to shoot those Union troops. I can't say that actually happened. What I'm saying is that would be the technique. And
Right.
so he fires on Fort Sumter, and Civil War starts. Of course, it didn't turn out the way they wanted it because Lincoln issued greenbacks. But that's the kind of stuff they will do. Um, and so they want women against men, blacks against whites, gays against straights, blah 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 blah. Anything they can do to create conflict. If you fall into that trap, if you decide that you want to, hate your neighbor or hate this guy over here, or listen to all this stuff, you're going to create a problem that they created. They're just egging you on.
And I think it's worth pointing out that that is a big principle within communism. Marx talked about this specifically, and it's called critical theory, right? Which is you always have to have an oppressor and an oppressed class in order for communism to work, especially in the revolutionary period. So, and when I say that, like the revolutionary part of communism, and so that holds weight. And what you're saying is exactly correct. The other thing I think too here is that it is a trap, right? Like if you look at January 6th, I firmly believe that was a trap, right? They wanted people to act up so that they could come down from on top and kind of quash that, right? And quash the movement. And so it's a complicated game that I think we have to play here, Phil, which is we have to stand our ground, but we can't get violent about it. You know what I mean? Because
Yeah,
then we spring the trap.
yeah, and that's exactly what they're helping for.
Well, man, this was good stuff.
Yeah.
So, where can people find the book?
Well, if they get a hold of you, I'll try and send them a copy or
Okay,
something.
get a hold of me. We'll have you make a
Prob-
small.
Yeah, yeah, probably $20 because it takes a lot of work to put that thing together.
Absolutely, it takes a little bit of work, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Yeah,
It takes a lot of work.
it does. So, yep, $20, 25 if you're feeling generous, and we'll get you hooked up. So, Phil, thanks, man. This was fun.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
All right, we'll talk to you later. Bye, everybody.